You wake before the rest of the house, though wake is not quite the word for it. Sleep in a longhouse is never deep in the way later centuries like to imagine. It comes in layers. Firelight breathing low, someone turning in the dark, a child murmuring once and settling, the faint animal warmth from the byre end of the building, smoke that never fully leaves, only thins and thickens with the night. Now the air has changed. It is colder against your face. The embers in the hearth have fallen inward and dulled to a red that looks almost black until you lean close enough to see it living underneath. For a moment you stay still under the wool, listening. That matters here. Listening comes before rising. You can tell a great deal before you move. No storm hammering the roof, no panicked stamping from the animals, no drunk shouting outside, no late return from the shore. Only the longhouse holding itself together in the hour before dawn, beams creaking softly as if the whole structure is stretching its back. You slip from the bedding carefully so you do not wake the child nearest you. Around you, bodies remain bundled in their places, shapes more than people. In this world, privacy is thin and morning begins in company, even when nobody is yet speaking. The house sees you as soon as you stand. The sleeping, the tools, the benches, the iron pot, the hanging cloth, the chest by the wall, the half-mended garment folded for later. Nothing belongs only to itself. Everything belongs to the day that is coming. Your first task is not dramatic. That is exactly why it matters. You kneel at the hearth and coax the fire back from what remains of the night. A scrap of dry kindling, a breath given carefully, another, not too hard, not wasteful. The first thin flame appears almost reluctantly, as if morning must be negotiated with. Then it catches, a little crackle, a little orange, enough to begin. That small success changes the room at once. The rafters come back slowly. The smoke begins its old familiar argument with the roof vent. The pot can be trusted again. The house, which a moment ago felt like a cave of wool and shadow, becomes a place where work can happen. In a settlement like this, with weather always waiting outside like an insult, that difference is never trivial. Heat is not comfort first, it is order. You draw your wrap closer and move through the first motions that will shape the rest of the day, checking what remains from yesterday, feeling the stiffness in your hands, counting without appearing to count what must be stretched and what can be spared. Grain, dried fish, ale, fuel, clean water if any was brought in before dark. If not, that too will need doing. So much of authority in a household begins like this, not with commands, but with remembering. Someone older in the family might once have shown you these habits, not as lessons spoken neatly aloud, but as things noticed and corrected. The fire allowed to die too far. The meal served too late. The cloth left damp too long. In a world where winter can lean on a household for months, small failures do not stay small for long. Behind you comes the sound of another sleeper waking, not fully, only the shift of weight, then stillness again. Soon the house will begin asking things of you without words. A child hungry, a younger girl slow to move, a man expecting food before labour, or before travel, or before going down to the boats. Perhaps he is husband, perhaps father, perhaps brother, perhaps the household's leading man in some other shape. The titles matter, but less than the rhythm beneath them. Men may stand more visibly in law and feud and voyage, but before any of that can happen, someone has to make the day start. The flame grows stronger. You hold your hands to it for one brief moment longer than necessary. In the half-light, your brooch catches just enough glow to answer back. Metal, cloth, wood, ash, breath. This is not the Viking world of carved prows and shouted glory. Not yet. Perhaps not even mostly. It is a reconstruction built from the quieter truth of things. The hour before sunrise, the labour no saga lingers over, the woman already awake while the rest of the house still dreams itself whole. And as the first real sounds of morning begin behind you, you understand what kind of life this will be told from. Not the edge of battle, the centre of endurance. The keys are where you left them, hanging from the belt you set near your bedding before sleep. Cold now when your fingers close around them. They do not jangle much. Even metal seems to understand the hour. Still, their weight is unmistakable. That weight says more than ornament ever could. In later imaginations, people like to dress this world in extremes, either filthy hardship or wild grandeur, either helpless women or saga queens speaking like carved statues. The truth, when it can be reached at all, is usually more domestic and more revealing. A woman's authority often lives here, in custody rather than performance, in what may be opened, in what must remain shut, in whether the grain chest lasts, in whether cloth is traded too soon, in whether the house enters winter with enough left to feel brave. You kneel by one of the storage chests and lift the lid only after a small pause, as though the act deserves respect. Wood, iron, the faint dry smell of grain and stored things. Nothing inside gleams, nothing announces itself as treasure. Yet this is the kind of wealth that decides whether a household looks competent by spring. Behind you, the first child is awake now. You hear it before you turn, not crying, just the small, breathy sound of someone surfacing unwillingly from sleep. You glance back, a tangle of wool, hair, blinking eyes. The look is familiar. Warmth has become visible now, and that means the day can no longer pretend it is not coming. You give the child a quiet task almost at once, not because you are unkind, but because households like this are built from early usefulness. Bring the wooden cup, fold that wrap, mind the younger one. Even childhood sits close to labour here, not harshly at every moment, not without tenderness, but undeniably. Hands are expected to learn. The light grows by degrees, filtering in from the smoke hole and the door edges in a colour that is neither night nor day. In it, the longhouse reveals itself more honestly. The benches worn smooth, the packed earth floor marked by yesterday's traffic, the loom weights waiting in stillness, a spindle set aside, a knife exactly where it should be. This kind of order is never accidental. It is made and remade daily, often by the same person, until competence becomes almost invisible. That invisibility is one of the quiet tricks of history. The more essential the labour, the easier it is for later storytellers to look past it. Someone coughs awake near the wall. Another shifts under a blanket and mutters something you do not catch. The house is rising unevenly, person by person, like embers finding flame at different speeds. Soon there will be voices, footsteps, requests disguised as assumptions. You move before they fully arrive. Water is checked. The pot is steadied. A crust from yesterday is broken apart for the youngest. You measure without measuring. Too much now, and you feel it later. Too little, and the morning sours into complaint or weakness. This is not just service, it is management, and everyone in the room lives partly inside your judgments, whether they name it or not. Then one of the men sits up, hair flattened from sleep, face still somewhere between boy and burden. He looks first toward the hearth, then toward you, only briefly, but that glance contains a whole structure. Has the fire returned? Is food coming? Is the day holding? You do not answer aloud. You do not need to. The answered fire is already there. Outside, beyond timber and turf and the last dimness before sunrise, the settlement is beginning its own slow awakening. Somewhere another woman is bent over another hearth. Somewhere a door bar is lifted. Somewhere animals are being fed, water carried, cloth shaken out, yesterday turned into today by hands that will not be sung about often enough. And that may be the clearest way into this world. Not through the famous voyages that leave the shore, but through the women who make departure possible and survival ordinary. The house is awake now. The keys rest again against your side. The fire has taken. Morning with all its needs has accepted your terms. By the time the room is properly awake, the longhouse has begun judging everyone by appearance. Not in the foolish way of later courts, with mirrors and rehearsed poses and silk too delicate for work. More practically than that. More quietly. A hem that has been cared for. A cloak pinned well enough to stay out of the way. Shoes that can survive wet ground. Hair brought into order before the day starts claiming it. In a world where so much can go wrong outdoors, the body must be prepared indoors first. You dress in layers that feel less like costume than readiness. Linen nearest the skin if the household can afford the comfort of it. Wool above, fastened where it needs to hold, not where it merely flatters. The cloth has memory. It knows the pull of your shoulders, the bend of your elbows, the places that wear first. Nothing about it is careless. Nothing can be. Even the smallest piece takes labour measured in patient hours. Sheep shorn, wool cleaned, fibres drawn out, thread spun, cloth woven, seams made, repairs repeated. To wear clothing here is to wear time. The brooches come next. They are useful before they are beautiful, though of course they are meant to be seen. Oval brooches, if you have them, sitting at the chest where they hold the overdress in place. A string of beads between them perhaps. Amber or glass or whatever the household possesses and keeps. A knife may hang there too. Small tools, small proofs. Not vanity exactly. More like visible evidence that you belong to a world where women are expected to carry, fasten, mend, distribute, unlock, remember. You do not look at yourself all at once. There is no great polished mirror waiting to flatter or accuse. Perhaps only a glimpse in a bit of metal, dim and partial, or the instinctive knowledge of your own arrangement as your fingers smooth cloth into place. This too changes the feeling of dressing. You're not composing an image for yourself alone. You're preparing to be read by others. That reading begins immediately. An older woman notices if your fastening is hurried. A younger one notices if it is neat. Children notice everything without understanding any of it. Men notice different things and often pretend they do not. A household learns to read competence from surfaces because surfaces are what the day first offers. If the belt is set properly, the key secure, the apron ready, the hair bound back, then the rest of the morning seems more likely to hold. You reach for the belt and feel again that familiar downward pull once it settles around your waist. This is where authority becomes physical. The knife, the pouch, perhaps the keys again, depending on the household and the moment. What hangs from the body tells a story that spoken claims do not need to repeat. Some women in the Norse world clearly held real responsibility inside the home economy, and later, graves, tools, and household objects suggest lives shaped by management as much as by obedience. Not unlimited power, not equality in any simple modern sense, but neither a life of decorative silence. The child from earlier watches you now with the solemn concentration children reserve for rituals they will one day perform without thinking. You tuck a loose edge back into place. You retie a cord. You pull another garment straighter over narrow shoulders, and for a second the whole room feels built from repetition across generations, one body learning from another how to become legible in its own time. At the far end of the house, someone laughs softly at some private morning annoyance. A man curses under his breath as he fumbles with a shoe thong. The sound is brief, almost gentle. The house is fully human now, warm enough to speak in, bright enough to see what still needs doing, and still, the work of clothing is not finished when the garments are on. You remain aware of them as the day begins to move around you, wool brushing at the wrist, the weight between the shoulders, the metal cool for a little longer before body heat claims it. Clothing here is not a layer between self and world. It is part of how the world grips you back. When you step away from the bedding and into the main space of the room, dressed for labour but marked also by status, memory and expectation, you can feel the old truth settling quietly into place. A Viking woman's clothing is never just what she wears. It is what the household has made possible, what her hands can sustain, what others can read from a glance, and what she must carry before she has spoken a single word. Hair takes longer than strangers would expect. Not because you're trying to look soft or ornamental before the day begins, but because loose hair is for other moments, and this is not one of them. Here, hair catches smoke, slips into food, tangles in wool, falls across the face when your hands are already busy, so you draw it back by habit. Fingers parting, gathering, smoothing, a cord, a pin, a twist that has been learned by repetition rather than vanity. What matters is not elaborate beauty, it is whether it stays, and yet appearance is never only practical. That is the other half of the truth. The Norse world does not admire neglect quite as much as later fantasy prefers to imagine. Grooming carries its own quiet dignity. Combs appear often enough in Viking finds to make one thing very clear. People cared how they met the eyes of others, not with fragile luxury perhaps, and not in a way that erased the roughness of weather and work, but with intention. A comb in a small case, hair arranged rather than abandoned, hands rinsed when water can be spared, faces wiped, clothing brushed and shaken. These acts do not float above daily life, they are daily life. You sit briefly near the better light and take up the comb. It catches once, then again more gently. There is patience in this too. Around you, the longhouse keeps moving. Someone lifting a bucket, someone shifting a bench, the small complaint of a child whose sleeve has gone where it should not. But for a few breaths you remain still, feeling the tug through your scalp, the slight pleasure of order being restored strand by strand. It is a private sensation in a room that allows very little privacy. A younger girl watches from nearby, pretending not to. She has reached that age when everything becomes part lesson, part comparison. She notices whether your braid sits firm, whether your dress hangs cleanly, whether your brooches match or merely serve. She notices too the parts of you the room reads without speaking, whether you look tired, whether you seem sharp-tempered, whether the morning has already taken something from you. Women and girls in close households become fluent in such readings early. It is one of the quiet literacies of shared living. You pass the comb to her for a moment and she holds it more reverently than she means to show. Such objects are ordinary only until you think of the labour behind them, the trade routes behind them, the fact that even a simple, well-made comb belongs to a world of craft, exchange, and habit. A household does not need a polished hall to understand refinement. It carries refinement in smaller ways, useful, portable, touched every day. By now the room has fully crossed into morning. The fire is no longer fragile. Steam begins to gather from the pot. One of the men, now dressed, runs a hand over his beard with the absent seriousness of someone trying not to look disordered before stepping outside. That too tells its own story. Care for appearance is not the province of women alone here, but the burden of making the household look and feel composed still gathers more heavily around you and the other women, because so many first impressions of order begin in what you have already done before dawn. You rise and adjust the last details almost without thinking. A fold straightened, a loose thread snapped away, the apron retied. The beads at your chest settle against the wool with a small familiar weight. They do not glitter much in this light. They do not need to. Their work is subtler than display. They remind the room, and perhaps remind you, that usefulness and dignity are not opposites. Outside, the weather waits with its own opinion of human effort. Mud if it has rained, wind if the fjord is restless, hard light on wet grass if the morning clears. What you wear cannot defeat any of that, but it can help you meet it without embarrassment, and that matters more than people admit. There is pride in being equal to your tasks before they begin, so when you finally move into the full current of the day, you do not feel dressed in the shallow sense. You feel fastened, prepared, legible to your own world, and that may be why the details linger. The comb passed from hand to hand, the braid tightened once, then trusted, the brooches at the chest, the belt at the waist, not decoration pasted over history, but history living at the surface of the body, where labour, status, self-respect and the gaze of others meet before breakfast is even served. The quern is already waiting for you, as patient and unimpressed as stone always is. By now the house has fully crossed from waking into appetite. Children have that sharper restlessness that comes before food. Men moving toward outdoor labour carry their hunger differently, more quietly perhaps, but with the same expectation beneath it. Even those who ask for nothing are asking. Morning in a household like this is measured not only by light, but by whether something warm will soon be placed into waiting hands. You kneel at the hand mill and pour in the grain a little at a time. Then comes the turning. It is never dramatic, which is exactly why the body remembers it so well. The circular push, the slight resistance, the rough sound of grain breaking down between stone surfaces, the feel of work that offers no surprise, only endurance. This is how so much of daily life holds together, not through rare feats of strength, but through motions repeated until they become part of the shape of your wrists, shoulders, and back. A morning meal begins long before the pot warms. It begins here, in the stubborn intimacy between hand and stone. Across the north, grain is not the only answer to hunger, and not every household eats the same way. Fish, dairy, dried stores, flatbread, porridge, ale. The table depends on land, season, fortune, and status. But whatever form it takes, food has to be wrestled out of planning first. Nothing in this room appears by accident. Every mouth enlarges the arithmetic. Every cold month sits invisibly beside the bowl. You keep turning. A child edges closer, then thinks better of speaking. The younger ones often treat this stage of breakfast with unusual seriousness, as though the grinding itself were a kind of spell. Perhaps because it almost is. Hard kernels go in. Something usable comes out. Hunger becomes manageable, if not generous. In a world where weather can undo confidence in a single season, that transformation must always have seemed slightly miraculous, even when it was tedious. The flour collects slowly. You brush it together, then set another portion to grind. The sound layers with the rest of the house, the hearth crackling more boldly now, someone pouring liquid into a wooden cup, the scuff of feet on packed earth, a quiet exchange near the doorway about weather or work or whether someone is going down toward the boats. Morning is a chorus of practical noises. No one names them beautiful while they're happening, but later ages, having forgotten what survival sounds like, would probably call them that. The pot takes the grain next. You stir as the mixture thickens, watching the surface change from watery uncertainty into something that can carry weight. A little more liquid, a little salt if it can be spared. Perhaps something left from yesterday, perhaps not. The line between ordinary competence and real skill is narrow here. Too thin, and it disappoints. Too thick, and it wastes. Burn it, and everyone notices. Stretch it well, and hardly anyone comments at all. Success in household work is often rewarded with silence. Still, silence is not the same as insignificance. Who eats first? Who is served more? Who gets the better portion? Who is expected to make do? These things speak their own language. Household meals are never only about hunger. They reveal standing, affection, fatigue, value, and the small daily politics of kin. A woman managing the morning meal is not simply filling bowls. She's navigating a map of relationships that must remain intact long after breakfast is forgotten. You lift the spoon and taste. It is plain, warm, reliable. That may be enough. A boy, old enough to be trying for dignity and too hungry to maintain it, hovers too near and is sent to fetch something useful just to keep him from asking whether it is ready. An older woman tears yesterday's bread with economical fingers. Someone at the far end of the house has begun speaking in that low, practical tone people use when discussing the tasks ahead. Sheep, perhaps. Fencing. A repair. A journey no farther than the next settlement, unless weather closes its hand around the day. You keep stirring, and the room begins to orient itself around the meal before it exists. That is one of the strange powers of morning food. It steadies people even before the first bite. The smell alone can quiet children. The sight of steam can soften tempers. Heat rising from a pot tells the household that the day, however uncertain it becomes later, has at least begun in order. And here, bent over breakfast while the house leans toward you without quite admitting it, you can feel one of the clearest truths of this life. Care is not sentimental first. It is logistical, rhythmic, sometimes tired, sometimes invisible, but it is still care. It arrives in the bowl before it ever reaches the tongue. When the bowls are finally set out, the room changes tone at once, not into peace exactly. A longhouse rarely offers anything so complete, but into a brief truce. Hands that were fumbling with belts, shoes, tools, loose cloth, now have somewhere to go. The children come forward first in spirit, if not always in rank, pulled by warmth and smell, and the simple relief of being allowed to want something openly. The older ones try to look less eager than they are. They fail. You ladle carefully. This is where the morning meal becomes visible as judgment. Not harsh judgment, perhaps. Not always. But judgment all the same. You know who worked late yesterday. You know who will spend the day outdoors if the weather holds. You know which child woke pale, which elder ate badly the night before. which pair of hands can be trusted to endure hunger without complaint, and which pair will grow clumsy too soon. The bowl passes from your hand carrying more than food. It carries your reading of the house. No one announces that. No one needs to. A woman in a Norse household could hold this kind of practical authority without ever mistaking it for freedom in the modern sense. The room depends on you, yes. But dependence is not the same as equality. That is one of the harder truths tucked into daily life here. You're central and still constrained, necessary and still expected. The meal makes that visible in its own quiet way. Everyone waits for it. Few would call it power allowed. A man near the door eats standing at first, too intent on whatever waits outside to sit properly. Another has already settled on the bench, elbows wide, talking between mouthfuls about the sky and whether the wind has changed. The older woman from before says little, but her eye catches everything. Who gulps, who leaves crumbs, who reaches without asking, who gives part of a portion to a smaller child when they think no one sees. Even breakfast becomes a record. You sit only briefly, and not with the full ease of those whose first hunger has already been answered by someone else's labour. One hand still remains half in service to the room. More hot water, more stirring from the pot. A cloth passed across the face of a child who has managed, within moments, to wear half the meal instead of swallowing it. Care is always trying to become chaos before breakfast is over, and yet there is comfort here too. The steam rises. Wooden spoons strike bowls with a small, dull rhythm. Bread tears. Someone laughs, unexpectedly, at something so minor it is forgotten before the laugh has ended. For a moment the longhouse sounds almost soft. Not quiet, but softened. Hunger makes a room sharp. Feeding it rounds the edges. You eat when you can. The taste is plain, as you knew it would be. Grain, warmth, a little salt. Perhaps the memory of smoke from the pot. Nothing a poet would praise unless the poet had spent enough time being cold and hungry. But that is the trick of simple food. It does not need to be exquisite to feel merciful. It only needs to arrive when it matters. In later stories, the Viking world is often made to seem all motion outward. Ships, raids, horizons, iron reputations. But mornings like this suggest a different engine beneath the legend. Before anything can be taken abroad, enough has to be held together at home. Before a man can go down to the shore or out to the field or into a feud, someone has already been awake long enough to grind, stir, portion, judge, and steady. The bowl in his hands may be plain, but it is part of the same world that later boasts of conquest. It simply receives less glory. One of the children asks for more and is refused, gently but firmly, because there must still be enough left for others, and for later. That refusal lands with the tiny injustice children always feel. Yet even that is part of the lesson being served this morning. Appetite does not rule the house. Measure does. To live well here, or even merely to continue, is to learn that wanting and having are rarely the same thing. By the time the bowls begin to empty, the room has started drifting outward again. A man reaches for his cloak. Someone checks a tool. A younger girl carries cups away with the grave importance of being trusted. The spell, if that is what breakfast briefly was, begins to break. But not entirely. A warm meal at dawn does more than fill the stomach. It tells each person, in ways too ordinary to name, that the household is functioning. The fire held. The stores were not wasted in the night. Someone was alert before the others. Someone remembered. And as you scrape the last from the pot, already thinking ahead to the next task before this one has fully ended, you understand that morning food is never just nourishment. It is proof. Proof that the day has been caught early, before it could scatter into need. By the time the bowls are rinsed and turned upside down to dry, the longhouse no longer feels like a place waking. It feels like a place already in motion, and motion inside a shared house has its own kind of pressure. No one can disappear here. That may be the first thing an outsider would learn, and perhaps never entirely get used to. The room is long, but not private. Beds are shared or close. Benches are close. Work happens beside sleep, and sleep beside tools, and tools beside children, and children beside adults with tempers they have learned to read from the sound of footsteps alone. Even silence is communal, especially silence. You cross the floor carrying a folded cloth and feel 3 different kinds of attention touch you without a word. A child watching because children always watch. An older woman watching because experience has made watching almost automatic. A man half noticing only that what he needs seems already to be where it should be. None of this is dramatic. That is why it matters. A woman in a Norse household lives not only by what she does, but by how constantly it is witnessed. At the far end of the house, one of the younger ones has begun squabbling over a wooden object too small to deserve the noise. The quarrel is not really about the object. It is about hunger not yet forgotten, or closeness, or jealousy, or the simple irritation of being young in a room where no feeling remains private for long. You look over before the voices sharpen too much, and that is enough. One of them drops his gaze. The other turns stubborn. There are a dozen ways to rule a room, but in a house like this the most useful one is often anticipation. You step in before conflict fully ripens, not with a speech. No one here has patience for speeches before mid-morning. Just a hand extended, a redirection. The smaller child sent to fetch something harmlessly important. The older one given a task just difficult enough to preserve dignity. Quarrels in crowded households are rarely solved by pure fairness. They're managed by timing, memory, and an instinct for which humiliation will linger and which will evaporate. Nearby, the older woman pretends not to notice your choice, which is one way older women approve of things. Had you handled it badly, she would certainly have noticed then. The house goes on around you. Bedding must be aired. A garment needs shaking out and checking at the seam where it began to give way yesterday. The hearth needs watching even now, because fire is useful only so long as it behaves. A bucket is moved. A stool scraped closer. The ordinary objects of life keep changing places, and each movement leaves a mark on the room's delicate order. A long house is not messy in the careless sense. It is busy. There is a difference. And beneath that busyness runs another truth. Not everyone inside this house stands in the same place. Kin matter. Age matters. Sex matters. Status matters. And sometimes status lives in places softer than law. In where one sits. Who asks and who tells. Who may correct whom. Who can be abrupt without consequence. If there are servants or thralls in the household, that hierarchy becomes sharper still, though daily dependence can blur it at the edges in complicated ways. People work beside one another, they do not therefore become equal. A younger woman near the loom glances toward you before making some small decision about thread, and you answer with the smallest nod. That is all. But again, the gesture contains more than it seems. Household authority often travels in fragments like this, not in declarations. A look, a pause, permission granted without ceremony, correction delivered lightly enough to save face. The room is full of such traffic. You stoop to gather a child's discarded wrap, and as you straighten, you catch the smell of wool, ash, stale sleep, warm milk, damp leather, and smoke woven so thoroughly into the timbers that the house seems to breathe them. Later centuries will remember ships, swords, silver, bold carved beasts. But a woman's daily life here is shaped just as much by these enclosed human odours, by the nearness of bodies, by the unending need to make shared space tolerable. That need can be tiring in ways no saga bothers to admire. To be rarely alone, to be needed before thought has fully formed, to understand that even your competence must often remain graceful, because anger spreads quickly in tight rooms. These are not grand burdens, yet they press on a life hour by hour until they become part of its posture. A child laughs suddenly at nothing worth repeating. Someone at the door calls for a tool. The older woman has begun sorting something with that severe economy of motion that makes younger people either hurry or leave her alone. The longhouse has become itself again, not a shelter in abstraction, but a crowded human machine, and you move through it knowing that every object, every pair of eyes, every small interruption is already telling you the same thing. This house does not merely contain your life, it tests it, all day, in public. Later, when people imagine strength in the Viking world, they often picture it outdoors, a man at an oar, a blade raised, a figure against weather. But indoor strength has its own harder discipline, and by mid-morning you are living inside it. The house is fuller now in a different way. Some have gone out to their work, yes, but others remain, and those who remain are often the ones who generate the most intricate demands. The very young, the very old, those whose labour begins later, those whose labour is less visible, those who carry out the endless tasks that make the larger tasks possible. This is where a household stops looking like a collection of people and starts behaving like a system, though a system made of moods, grudges, tiredness, affection, and memory. One child begins to cry, not loudly, but persistently, over some grievance too small to survive the afternoon, and large enough to consume the moment. Another hovers close beside you for no reason, except the human need to remain near the person, who seems to know what comes next. At the same time, someone older asks where a certain tool has been put, as if tools naturally migrate unless women pin them to the earth. You answer without turning. That in itself is a skill, knowing the room well enough to speak into it while your hands continue elsewhere. A household like this runs on a form of knowledge that leaves few traces in formal history. Who is likely to flare if corrected in front of others? Which child is truly ill and which one is only hungry, offended, or tired? Which older relative wants help but would rather accept it disguised as coincidence? Which morning silence is ordinary, and which means resentment has not finished from the night before? These are not small matters. Misread them often enough and the house grows sharp at the edges. Read them well, and people begin to think peace is simply the natural state of things. It never is. You feel it now in the way one conversation nearly turns. A remark passed too quickly. A look held half a heartbeat too long. Nothing anyone from outside would notice, but you notice. The room changes pressure the way weather does. You move between tasks without making your movement look like intervention, lifting one object, setting down another, sending someone to the doorway, drawing another into work before idle talk can become insult. This is diplomacy in wool sleeves, carried out on a packed earth floor. No one thanks diplomacy while it is working. That is one of its stranger dignities. Near the wall, a young woman has paused over her sewing, not because the seam is difficult, but because her thoughts have slipped elsewhere. Perhaps worry, perhaps resentment, perhaps only fatigue. You sit beside her for a moment under the excuse of checking the cloth. You say very little. In close households, comfort often arrives sideways. A direct question may force a person into pride. A shared task lets them remain intact. After a while, she resumes. The seam continues. So does the day. There are harder realities underneath all this. In some Viking households, enslaved people were present. In others, the hierarchy may have been less extreme yet still unmistakable. Kinship could shelter, but it could also trap. A woman might hold authority inside her domain, and still live inside a structure shaped by male inheritance, male alliances, male claims made elsewhere in law and custom. The room does not erase those truths just because it relies on you. It simply complicates them. Dependence travels in more than one direction here. You pause at the doorway for a breath of colder air and look back in. The longhouse is dimmer away from the hearth, beams dark above, smoke caught in the higher spaces, light touching only parts of faces and hands. From here the room looks almost calm. A child bent over some serious small occupation. Cloth in a lap, a cup passed, someone mending, someone sorting, someone resting without truly resting. If you did not know better, you might think the peace belonged to the house itself, but you do know better. Peace, such as it is, has been made, maintained, adjusted minute by people, and often by women, whose labour is easiest to overlook because it leaves the room looking ordinary. That may be the most deceptive surface in history, a household that appears to be simply functioning. When you step back inside, the warmth meets you again, together with the old mingled sense of smoke, wool, milk, damp wood, and breath. Someone asks for you at once. Of course they do, and as you turn to answer, without surprise and not without weariness, you feel the private truth that sits beneath the public one. Life in a Viking household is not only labour of the hands, it is labour of attention, of timing, of self-command, of being woven so tightly into the needs of others that even the rare quiet moments still ring with readiness. The spindle begins moving almost before the room is ready for it. That is the nature of textile work here. It slips into the day wherever hands can spare a little steadiness. Between interruptions, beside conversation, near the hearth when the light is better, closer to the doorway when smoke grows stubborn, farther in again when the wind changes its mind. Wool is patient, but it is never finished. That may be the first thing you feel when you take the distaff into your hand. This work is not a task with neat edges. It is a current running underneath life itself. You draw out the fibres carefully. Too fast and the thread weakens. Too slow and the rhythm breaks. The spindle turns, drops, twists, gathers. The motion is small, almost graceful from a distance, but the grace comes from repetition rather than ease. Fingers learn tension the way a good ear learns pitch. You do not need to think about every turn now. The body has already been taught. Even so, the wool punishes distraction. A thick patch here, a thinning there. One careless pull and the line breaks, leaving you to join it again with more patience than pride. Around you, the longhouse continues its usual claims on your attention. A child asks something. Someone crosses behind you, carrying a bundle of cloth that smells faintly of damp storage. The older woman from before is sorting through another piece of work nearby, not speaking, though silence beside another worker is not emptiness. It is company of a more durable sort. The thread lengthens. In later tales, people often treat cloth as background, as if garments simply existed once the exciting part of history began. But in a Norse household, wool is never background. Wool is time. Wool is winter survival. Wool is bedding, cloaks, tunics, sailcloth, wrapping, exchange, repair, dowry, status, preparedness. If a household falls behind in textile work, the consequences do not remain decorative for long. Someone goes cold. Something tears and cannot be replaced easily. Trade narrows. Respectability frays right along with the seam. You wet your fingers lightly and smooth another uneven section. There is a seriousness to this that outsiders might miss because it looks so quiet. No raised voices, no iron ringing, no animals straining against rope, just the almost invisible making of thread. Yet some scholars have argued quite reasonably that textile production in the Viking world was one of the great engines of domestic economy. When you spin, you're not passing time. You're converting raw material into security. The younger girl from earlier wanders close again, drawn by the movement. You let her watch for a while before handing her a little of the wool to hold. She tries to imitate the motion with the solemn confidence of the inexperienced, and for a few moments the room gains that particular sweetness created when instruction appears without announcing itself as instruction. You correct her only once, quietly, when she grips too tightly and nearly ruins the drawer. She flushes, then concentrates harder. Pride is as delicate as thread at that age. Across the room, hanging from the loom, weights wait in stillness for their turn to matter. They are heavy, plain, almost severe in appearance, yet they promise the next stage of the work. The moment when spun thread becomes cloth, and cloth becomes something the household can depend on. Even weighting tools carry pressure here. They remind you that no part of the process stands alone. A bit of fleece drifts loose and catches briefly in the warmer air above the hearth before settling to the floor. You watch it fall and think, not for the first time, how much of a woman's life in this world passes through the hands in forms too soft to seem powerful. Wool, flax, yarn, fabric, worn cloth turned and restitched, scraps saved because scraps become used later. But softness is not weakness. Soft things line cradles, pad chests, shield skin from cold, wrap the sick, mark the respectable, fill ships with sails. By now the spindle has given you a satisfying length of even thread. You wind it, begin again, and feel the old rhythm reclaim you. The room may see only a woman sitting with wool in her lap. History, if it looks closely enough, sees something much larger. The household being held together one careful strand at a time. Later in the morning the work shifts from thread to cloth, and the whole room seems to tighten around it. The loom does not ask for haste. It resists haste. It stands there with its weighted threads and measured spaces, demanding the kind of attention that cannot be faked for long. You come to it with the spun yarn gathered, with your thoughts still half divided between the fabric and the rest of the house, and at once the loom insists that division will not do. Weaving punishes wandering more visibly than spinning. A missed path, a poor tension, a hand too quick or too tired, and the mistake sits in front of you where everyone can see it. You pass the weft through, back and forth, lift and lower, draw it home, beat it into place. The sounds are modest but firm, wood against thread, the quiet thud of order being built line by line. There is something deeply satisfying in it when the rhythm holds. Not joy exactly, because joy suggests freedom from pressure, and this work has plenty of pressure still. But satisfaction, yes. The sort that comes from seeing effort become structure, while your hands are still inside it. A child reaches toward the loom weights and is turned away with sharper urgency than the child expects. The look of surprise on the small face is almost offended. You soften your voice only after the danger has passed. The weights are not toys. The threads are not play. The whole device is a kind of patience made visible, and one careless hand can undo hours. In a house where so many tasks must absorb interruption, weaving remains one of the few that openly demands respect. Perhaps that is part of why it carries so much meaning. A woven cloth is never merely cloth here. It may become a tunic, a cloak, a wrapping for storage, a bed covering, a gift sent outward, a piece of a marriage portion, something traded, something cut down and remade when it wears thin. It enters lives in stages, first as labour, then as usefulness, then as memory. Later someone may know a person by the garment they wore often, by the brooches pinned through it, by the way the fabric aged along the elbow or hem. Textile work begins as necessity and ends by shaping how a household appears to the world. The younger woman who paused over her sewing earlier now helps hold the finished edge while you check the line of the work. The two of you say little. The cloth says enough. Tight here, sound there. One small unevenness near the side, not ruinous, only human. No one in this room mistakes labour for magic. A good piece of weaving is admired precisely because everyone understands what it costs. Near the hearth, the older woman glances over at last and gives the barest nod. Again, the economy of approval. A worse judge might lavish praise carelessly. She never does. Which means that when she allows herself even that small sign, it lands with real weight. You continue. Outside, someone calls. A dog answers. Wind presses once against the walls and moves on. Life keeps tugging at the edges of the task, but the loom holds you in its own stricter tempo. Up, through, down, pull, beat. It begins to feel less like making and more like settling a dispute between loose things, persuading separate strands to accept a future together. There is a lesson in that, though not one anyone here would bother to phrase aloud. Households too are made by tension properly held. Too slack and they fail. Too tight and they snap. By midday your shoulders have begun to feel the work in a different way than they felt the quern or the pot. This is a more fixed strain, less obvious, but it lingers. Textile labour often does. It leaves its mark quietly. The neck stiff at evening, the fingers still remembering resistance after the hands are empty. That quietness is one reason such work disappears so easily in grander stories. It does not shout its cost, and yet the Viking world would look very different without it. Ships needed sails, bodies needed warmth, status needed visible form, trade needed goods, marriage needed objects that could travel between families and hold value beyond the feast day. The famous outward life of the age rested partly on inward work like this, on women bent over thread and loom in rooms that smelled of smoke and wool. At last you pause and lay your hand flat against the woven section, feeling its firmness under your palm. There it is, not finished, never that quickly, but real, growing. A man returning briefly through the room may notice only that cloth is being made, in the same way he notices fire when it is already burning, or food when it is already served. But you know what sits inside those neat lines. Morning hours, trained fingers, withheld impatience, saved material, corrected error, inherited skill. The fabric looks calm. The labour inside it is anything but accidental. And as you stand back from the loom for a moment, letting your shoulders ease and your eyes rest on what has taken shape, you understand why thread and cloth carry such weight in this life. They are not side work. They are one of the ways a woman turns time itself into shelter. By the time you step outside, the day has already gathered its real weather. Inside, the longhouse could soften things a little. Smoke blurred the edges. Fire argued with cold. Wool and timber kept the wind at a distance, even when they could not truly defeat it. Outside, there is no such negotiation. The air touches your face directly, cool and damp enough to wake every thought at once. The ground is uneven underfoot, marked by traffic, weather, hooves, spilled water, and the slow trampling of daily life into earth. The yard is already speaking in chores. A bucket waiting near the doorway. A patch of mud turned darker where someone has recently crossed. A faint, sharp smell from the animals. Wooden vessels needing rinsing. A fence that does not look broken exactly, but no longer looks trustworthy either. Nothing here presents itself as grand labour. Everything presents itself as the next necessary thing. You gather your skirts a little and move toward the byre end first. The animals know the hour almost as well as you do. They shift, breathe, stamp, watch. Their needs do not care what else the house must manage. Milk will not wait because thread had to be spun. A tether does not hold because a child was crying. The outdoor work begins with that simple humiliation every practical life eventually learns. The world of bodies keeps its own schedule. You crouch beside the milk vessel, your hands already remembering the motion before the first warm streams strike the container. The sound is soft, rhythmic, almost more intimate than speech. Steam rises faintly in the chill air. The animal's flank is warm near your shoulder. For a few moments the whole world narrows to pressure, release, warmth, patience. It would be easy for later imaginations to miss the importance of this because the act looks so ordinary. But dairy work mattered enormously across much of the Norse world. Milk, butter, curds, skyr, whey. These were not luxuries floating around the edges of life. They were part of how households endured. A woman working with animals and dairy was not engaging in some rustic side task. She was helping shape the household's actual margin of safety. You finish, shift the vessel carefully, and check the next thing before the first can even be set aside. That is the feeling of outdoor domestic work here. No clean transitions, only overlapping necessities. Water must be carried or checked. Waste must be dealt with. Tools left outside must be judged against the sky. The yard and its edges reveal yesterday's neglect immediately. Indoors, disorder can sometimes be folded, stacked, or dimmed by smoke. Outside, weather becomes the critic. A younger helper trails after you, useful in bursts and distracting in equal measure. You give small instructions as you go. Lift that end. Not like that. Use both hands. Watch the mud. No, not there. A woman's labour outdoors includes training as much as doing, though training rarely slows the work enough to feel noble. It usually feels like doubling it. Beyond the nearer buildings and fences, the land opens in ways both generous and unforgiving. Depending on place and season, women in Norse settlements could be involved in tasks well beyond the doorway, helping with haymaking, gathering, processing food stores, tending animals, carrying, preserving, checking what the weather was about to ruin if no one acted in time. The old modern division between inside and outside, between women's work and real work, grows hard to maintain once you stand here with cold air in your lungs and muck on your shoes. You set the milk aside and turn to the stored containers, checking lids, lifting one, then another. A household lives and dies by such inspections more often than by anything dramatic. Has damp got in? Has something spoiled? Has a vessel cracked? Has a careless hand left something exposed? This is the kind of vigilance that never looks heroic because it succeeds by preventing scenes from happening. A breeze comes across the yard carrying the smell of wet earth. Animals, wood smoke and distant salt if the settlement lies near open water. It catches the edge of your wrap and reminds you how little softness the day intends to offer. Still, there is satisfaction here too. Not comfort exactly, but clarity. Outside, tasks reveal themselves honestly. The bucket is empty or it is not. The fence will hold or it will not. The animal is fed or it is not. Compared with the subtler politics of the longhouse, the yard can feel almost blunt. Almost. Because even out here, rank and expectation follow you. Who is trusted with the better animals? Who decides what is used now and what is saved? Who carries and who directs? Who is still learning and who is already assumed to know? The open air does not erase hierarchy. It merely spreads it across a wider space. You straighten slowly, one hand against the small lake beginning at your lower back, and look over the yard as if reading a page already half written. The day is no longer a matter of waking or preparing. It is underway now, fully, and it has carried you beyond the hearth without releasing you from responsibility. If anything, the world outside the door has only widened the list. Later, with the first pressing tasks in the yard answered, the work spreads farther outward and becomes less tidy to name. This is the point where later people often begin making mistakes. They imagine domestic life ending at the threshold, as though a woman's world stopped where the longhouse wall did. But the settlement does not organise itself so neatly. Not when fodder has to be handled. Not when food must be preserved. Not when animals wander, tools weather, stores shift, and the season keeps asking the same hard question in 100 different forms. Are you ready for what comes next? You move toward the place where yesterday's gathered things have been left to sort. Some need drying, some need trimming, some need to be turned, tied, carried, stacked or judged before they spoil or sour or split. Depending on region and season, that might mean fish, herbs, dairy, hides, fuel, fodder, or some less glamorous mixture of all of them. Norse life is built from materials in states of transition. Very little arrives finished. Most things are being turned into something else by labour, smoke, salt, wind, time, or luck. A basket tips slightly where it has been left on uneven ground. You right it with one foot before it can spill and feel a flicker of satisfaction so small it hardly deserves the name. Yet such moments accumulate. A day like this is made bearable partly by tiny victories over inconvenience, something saved before it falls, something moved before the rain comes, something remembered before it is lost. The younger helper is better now that the work has become more physical. Some children, some adolescents too, are made steadier by having weight in their hands instead of instructions in their ears. You let them carry what can be carried, correct the posture when the load tilts, and pretend not to notice the brief look of pride when they manage it well. In households like this, usefulness is one of the first adult languages a young person learns to speak. Beyond the immediate yard, other motions echo your own. Someone at another house is shaking cloth in the wind. A figure bends near a fence line. Two people carry a pole between them. Somewhere farther off comes the bark of a dog and the thin metallic sound of a tool striking something that refuses to yield. The settlement is not loud exactly, but it is alive with work. The famous Viking world of ships and voyages begins here, on the landward side of things, where women's labour and men's labour overlap more than legend likes to admit. You stoop to gather fuel, not enough to feel triumphant, but enough to matter later. That is the measure of much of this life, enough to matter later. Wood too green smokes badly. Dung cakes need drying. Peat, if used, must be cut, moved, and stacked with foresight. Fire inside the house seems simple only because so much labour has already taken place outside it. You know that in your hands, in the slight roughness on the fingers, in the habit of assessing each piece almost before you touch it. Good fuel means less waste, less choking smoke, steadier heat, better food, fewer irritations by nightfall. Again, a whole chain of consequences begins in things that barely look worthy of story. Then comes the fence, not broken, as you noticed earlier, but doubtful. You kneel by it now and test the loosened place more honestly. Wood flexes where it should resist. The binding has begun to give, not disastrously, not yet. But not yet is one of the most dangerous phrases in any working household. It is the phrase that turns into trouble at dusk or in rain, or after animals have already slipped through. So you deal with it. The repair is awkward rather than elegant. Your hands pick up dirt. The wood resists the angle you want. The younger helper hands you something only after first handing you the wrong thing. You do not sigh, though you could. You tighten, adjust, test again. Better. Not perfect. Good enough to trust for now. Much of practical competence lives in that phrase, good enough to trust for now. The world rarely offers finished certainty. A gust of wind moves across the open ground and brings with it the smell of sea or river again, mixed with manure, damp grass, animal heat, and smoke from several hearths at once. It is not a poetic smell, not in any soft or polished sense, yet it is honest. It smells like people refusing to let raw materials remain raw. It smells like effort pressed against season. You straighten, brushing your hands against your apron, and for a moment you look back toward the longhouse. From here it seems sturdy, almost restful, its roofline low against the sky. But you know better than that. Rest inside must be earned out here first, and that may be the deeper truth of this part of the day. Outdoor work does not interrupt a Viking woman's domestic life. It completes it. The milk, the fence, the fuel, the stores, the carrying, the checking, the endless small decisions under open sky. These are not tasks at the edge of the story. They are the story, just as much as the firelit room. When you turn back toward the house, the cold has settled into your fingers, and the list of what still remains feels no shorter than before. Even so, something in the day has clarified. You have stepped beyond the doorway and found not freedom from responsibility, but its wider shape. By midday, the day has hardened into its social shape, and you can feel it most clearly when talk turns toward marriage. Not because anyone announces it with ceremony. No one clears the room and says, "Now we shall discuss the structure that governs half this life." It comes more quietly than that, in a remark about a neighbouring household, in a question about wool promised elsewhere, in the glance one woman gives another when a man's name is mentioned, in the way older kin begin speaking of futures as though they were fields already marked out with boundary stones. You are inside one of those conversations before it fully declares itself. An older relative, hands busy with some task that gives her the right to sound casual, mentions a woman from another farmstead whose match has finally been settled. There is no romance in the telling, not at first. The talk turns instead to what each family gains, what distances are involved, whether the man's people are reliable, whether the woman will be treated with reasonable respect, whether the property arrangement is sound, whether the timing is wise. It is all spoken in the practical language of weather and stores, as if marriage were simply another form of household management. In some ways, of course, it is. That is one of the hardest truths to approach gently. A Viking woman's marriage may include affection, companionship, desire, loyalty, even tenderness if fortune and temperament allow. But it does not begin in those things alone. It begins inside kinship, alliance, property, reputation, and survival. A household is not merely a place to sleep and eat. It is an economic body, a legal fact, a defensive structure, a source of standing. Marriage decides where a woman's labour, fertility, skill, and loyalty will be anchored. No one living in this world can afford to pretend otherwise for long. The younger women hear all this, even when nobody seems to be addressing them directly. You see it in the way one of them keeps her eyes lowered over her work while missing a stitch she would not normally miss. You hear it in the pause before another speaks. Youth in a household like this is often lived under a strange double pressure, to become useful and to become marriageable, with the two states overlapping so completely that it can be hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. A woman is observed not only for beauty, though beauty has its place. She is observed for steadiness, skill, temper, reputation, whether she can carry a room without stirring resentment, whether she can keep stores from disappearing, whether children quiet in her presence, whether cloth improves in her hands. No one says all that in one breath. They do not need to. The house has been saying it for years. A man near the doorway speaks a little too confidently about what makes a good match, and the older woman nearest the hearth gives him a look so dry it almost counts as a laugh. That too belongs to the scene. Men may stand publicly closer to the formal arrangements of marriage, but women often understand the actual costs more intimately. They know what kind of household swallows a young bride whole. They know what sort of mother-in-law hardens a room. They know the difference between a man who is merely stern and one whose temper ruins the weather indoors. They know how far a woman can bend before daily life becomes something colder than disappointment. You continue sorting, folding, adjusting whatever task is in your hands, because hands give dignity to difficult listening. Some Norse women, depending on time, place and status, had more say in marriage arrangements than many women elsewhere in medieval Europe would later have. That matters, but it should not be exaggerated into modern freedom. Family strategy still presses hard. A father, brothers, male kin, household interests, all these form the frame. Consent may matter more than later myth sometimes allows, yet consent inside a narrow world is rarely simple. A woman may choose among pressures, not outside them. The room falls quiet for a moment after someone mentions a match that turned sour in a nearby district. No details are offered at first, just enough to let the silence fill with speculation. Then a little more emerges. Not scandal exactly, only the familiar story of poor judgment, difficult kin, expectations misread, a household that looked sound from outside and wore differently within. Such stories circulate for a reason. They are warnings disguised as gossip. You lift a folded garment and lay it down again, though you no longer need to. That is what this topic does to a room. It changes the weight of ordinary movements. Marriage in this world is not an isolated life event pinned brightly to a feast day. It is a threshold whose consequences echo through bedding, meals, property, labour, rank, pregnancy, widowhood, old age. Everything after depends partly on where and with whom a woman is placed. And because that truth is too large to say directly, the household approaches it sideways, in half comments and practical phrases, while the day goes on around it. Someone pours drink, a child drifts too close and is sent away. Outside, wind touches the wall and moves on. Inside, the conversation settles like a second weather, one everyone feels and no one can entirely escape. By afternoon, the talk has thinned, but its pressure remains in the room like smoke after the fire settles lower. That is often how marriage works here. Not as one great speech or one single bargain laid dramatically on the table, but as a condition of life that keeps revealing itself in smaller forms. A chest discussed, a garment put aside, a question about land or livestock, or what a woman may bring with her and what she may expect in return. The language stays practical because practicality is the only safe way to handle something so large. You carry a folded length of cloth to the chest and pause before placing it inside. It is not difficult to see how material things gather emotional force in a household like this. Cloth is not only cloth. A chest is not only storage. A brooch is not only adornment. These objects move across marriages, mark standing, help build a new home, or protect a woman from entering it empty-handed. What later ages might call dowry, or bride wealth, or household property does not feel like theory here. It feels like wood under the hand, wool under the fingers, metal with a little inherited weight in it. An older woman joins you, not to lecture, but to inspect what is being put by. She touches the cloth between finger and thumb, testing it more as judgment than curiosity. Good enough. Worth something. Worth keeping. The room does not need many words. In societies like this, objects often speak before people do. A family's seriousness can be read in what it can send with a daughter, what it refuses to part with, what it expects her to guard, what it assumes she can manage once she crosses another threshold. Across much of the Norse world, marriage was not simply the union of two temperaments. It bound families, property, and future claims. A woman might carry some rights with her. She might expect maintenance. She might retain ties to the kin she came from. In some cases, she might even seek separation later under certain conditions. These things matter, and they make the picture more complex than the old fantasy of the silent traded woman. Yet complexity is not the same as ease. Any right that exists inside a strongly male-shaped social order still has to survive the personalities and pressures of real households. That is the part older women understand in their bones. One of them begins telling, almost absently, of a bride she once knew who arrived at her husband's farm with a chest finer than the room she had to live in afterward. The line is spoken with dry humour, but it lands harder than humour alone. Everyone knows what it means. Goods can travel with a woman. Security does not always travel as easily. A strong marriage arrangement on the day of negotiation may still sour under bad temper, miserliness, incompatible kin, or the slow erosion caused by a house that never really lets a newcomer belong. You keep your eyes on the chest as though the arrangement of cloth requires your full attention. Sometimes that is how women protect one another in conversation, by allowing painful truths to remain attached to objects instead of exposing them too nakedly in the air. A younger woman can listen while pretending to sort. An older one can warn while pretending to reminisce. Advice arrives sideways, and because it arrives sideways, pride can bear it. A man passes through the doorway and asks some practical question about a tool, or food, or whether something has been set aside. The interruption is ordinary. Still, it changes the room at once. The women's conversation narrows. Nothing is exactly hidden, yet the tone shifts. Marriage may concern everyone, but women often speak most honestly about it in moments not fully supervised by male certainty. They know too well how easily men can describe an arrangement as sound because they will not be the ones folding themselves into its daily corners. Outside, a cart creaks somewhere beyond the house. A dog answers once. Inside, the older woman lifts another item and sets it aside with that same clear-eyed economy. Not this one. Keep that one. Send this. Save that. The gestures are practical, yet beneath them lies a whole education in what marriage really demands. Not merely willingness, not merely fertility, not merely a feast and witnesses, but resources, judgment, resilience, and the ability to endure being read by another household from the moment you arrive. You close the chest and rest your hand on the lid a moment longer than necessary. There is something almost solemn in that pause, because by now the deeper shape of the afternoon has become clear. Marriage in this world is not a dream waiting to happen. It is infrastructure. It can hold tenderness within it, yes. It can even become love in the slower, truer sense of shared weather and proved loyalty. But first it is placement, negotiation, risk. A woman steps into it carrying not only herself but the hopes, calculations and reputation of the people behind her. And as the room moves on to other tasks as though nothing especially important has been said, you feel how profoundly daily life is already being arranged around futures that have not arrived yet. The cloth in the chest, the glance between older women, the warning tucked inside a joke, the knowledge that a marriage may begin at a feast table, but it is measured afterward in storage, in labour, in temper, in whether a woman is allowed to remain fully herself once the door closes behind her. By late afternoon, the room has grown quieter in the way rooms do when harder subjects are no longer being spoken openly, but have not left. You feel it most when someone mentions, almost in passing, a woman who went back to her kin. No one says the word too sharply. No one leans in. The sentence is set down lightly, as though it were only another fact among many. But it changes the air all the same. A woman returning to her own people after marriage is never just a detail. It means something has strained badly enough to be named. It means alliances have shifted, or tempers have failed, or the protections built into an arrangement have become necessary rather than ceremonial. Even the way the room receives the remark tells you as much as the remark itself. No laughter, no easy gossip, just that brief, collective stillness in which practical minds begin measuring consequences. You're sorting small household things while this happens. A spindle whirl, a strip of cloth, a small knife that ought not to be where it was left. The hands stay busy because the mind works better that way. In houses like this, difficult truths are often approached while someone is mending, stacking, scraping, or folding. Motion gives the word somewhere to land. The older woman near the hearth is the first to say more. Not much. Only that a woman is not without recourse if a marriage becomes intolerable. The sentence is plain, almost stern. It offers no comfort in its tone, only accuracy. That matters. In parts of the Norse world, women did possess more legal standing than later fantasy sometimes grants them. Under some conditions, separation could be sought. property claims could matter. A woman was not always swallowed without trace into her husband's line, but none of this turns the world gentle. Any formal right still depends on whether kin support you, whether the case can be carried, whether the household you leave will accept disgrace quietly, whether the household you return to can absorb you again without resentment or loss. Rights on a good day look firmer than rights under pressure. A younger woman at the far end of the room pretends not to be listening and fails entirely. Her needle has stopped. Her eyes remain lowered, but not to the work. You do not look at her directly. That would make the moment too naked. Instead, you keep placing one object after another where it belongs, while the conversation continues in that half-practical register women use when speaking of danger, without letting it dominate the room. Another voice adds that property must be watched carefully. What came with a woman matters. What is hers? What remains tied to her kin? What may be expected back? What can be lost through confusion or pressure, or simply the louder will of others? These are not theatrical concerns. They live in chests, belts, brooches, livestock, woven goods, stored food, the sort of things people touch every day, and therefore sometimes forget are also legal and emotional facts. A woman's security is often distributed across ordinary objects. That may be why they're handled with such care. You lift the lid of a chest again and smell wool, wood, a trace of iron, and the drying clothes smell of things kept against future need. It is strange how much of a life can sit inside a box. Clothing for hard weather, cloth that can be traded, something inherited, something promised, something too valuable to use carelessly and too necessary to keep untouched forever. The contents do not announce themselves as power. Yet sometimes this is what power looks like in a woman's hands here. Stored competence, stored value, stored evidence that she did not come empty into the world and need not leave empty either. Outside, a voice calls briefly from the yard and is answered. The household steady. Inside, the talk has become even quieter and somehow more serious for that. No one romanticizes the matter. No one says a woman may simply walk away if unhappy, as though she were stepping out of a badly woven shoe. The costs are too obvious for such nonsense. Separation, dispute, public accusation, kin drawn in, property sorted, reputation tested. These things shake more than two people. They shake structures, which is exactly why the existence of such a possibility matters. It tells you that marriage, for all its weight, is not imagined as an unbreakable sacred mist. It is an arrangement with obligations, and obligations can fail. That knowledge changes the way the room feels. Not freer exactly, but clearer. A woman's life in this world remains bounded by family strategy, social expectation, childbearing, labour, vulnerability, and the enormous fact of male public authority. None of that vanishes. Yet neither is she only a decorative captive in her own story. She may manage goods, preserve ties to kin, and, under certain circumstances, insist that a bad arrangement be recognised as bad. That is not modern independence, but it is not nothing. In daily life, not nothing can be the difference between despair and endurance. You close the chest and slide the small knife back to its proper place. The room resumes its breathing. Someone moves near the doorway. Someone else resumes sewing. The younger woman's hand begins again, stitch by stitch, as if the pause had meant nothing. But it did mean something. It revealed one of the hidden doors inside this world. Narrow, difficult, costly, but real. As evening edges nearer, the conversation turns from rights in the abstract to something harder to hold. What it actually costs a woman to use them. That is where the room grows most honest. Not louder, never louder. Honest in the older way, where people lower their voices because truth is already heavy enough. A woman may leave, someone says, if matters become unbearable. Yes. But where does she go first? To her own kin, if they will take her. And if they do, under what strain? A daughter returning is not only a daughter returning. She's another mouth, another bed space, another problem that may become public, another reminder that an alliance once agreed upon has not held. The older woman near the hearth picks up a garment that needs mending and works at it while she speaks, her eyes on the cloth rather than anyone's face. That, too, is part of how difficult things are said here. You do not pin them directly onto another person unless you must. You let the thread pass through wool. You let the words pass through the air the same way. She says a woman needs more than hurt feelings to survive such a change. She needs support. She needs witnesses, perhaps. She needs people willing to stand beside her version of the household and not automatically accept the man's. She needs enough left in her own name, or enough kin behind her, not to return stripped of dignity. The room receives each of these truths without argument because none of them sound surprising. That is what makes them grave. A younger child wanders too close and is sent off with a wooden spoon and a task invented on the spot. The child accepts the mission with solemn importance and disappears. For a few moments the older women say nothing. You hear only the low pop of the fire, the murmur of movement at the other end of the house, the tiny scrape of needle through cloth. You begin retying a bundle of stored items, tightening the cord more carefully than necessary. Some women, no doubt, endured more than they wished because returning was harder than staying. That is the shape of many societies, and there is no reason to pretend the Norse world floated free of it. A legal possibility is not the same thing as an easy path, yet the very existence of the possibility leaves its mark on daily life. It means a woman is not imagined purely as absorbed forever, with no claim left behind her. Her birth family still matters. Her property may still matter. Her public standing is not entirely dissolved into another household's will. That complexity is one reason the room refuses simple stories. No one here is foolish enough to describe marriage as either prison or freedom. It is too mixed for that. A good marriage may become a place of mutual reliance, even respect, perhaps even the kind of affection that grows best under weather rather than poetry. A bad one may become a narrowing corridor a woman has to calculate her way out of. Most likely many are both at different moments. Household life wears people down and binds them closer at the same time. Contradiction is not a flaw in the picture, it is the picture. A woman across the room says something dry and understated about a husband who is easier to leave in story than in winter. That earns the nearest thing to laughter the subject can manage. Not because the room finds suffering amusing, but because women have always used wit to say what cannot safely be said in a raw form. The line lingers, everyone understands it. Leaving may be possible. Leaving in snow, with children, with limited stores, with uncertain welcome, with a reputation suddenly under discussion. That is another matter. You shift the bundle into the chest and close the lid softly. The sound seems to settle the thought as much as the objects. Outside, dusk is beginning to collect itself. The light at the door has gone from pale to thinner, flatter, more undecided. Inside, the longhouse has that late-day feeling of labour still continuing, even as bodies start quietly counting what remains. There are always more small things to put right before dark fully claims the room. And perhaps that is what this whole subject resembles most. Not a dramatic gateway flung open or shut, but a narrow path through a crowded house. Real, but difficult to walk. Available, but full of cost. A woman may have recourse. She may have claims. She may not be wholly trapped inside silence. But every one of those truths must pass through kinship, property, season, reputation, and the plain fact that survival itself leaves little room for clean choices. You rise and adjust the wrap at your shoulders, feeling the day in your back now, the mild ache that comes from bending, lifting, carrying, paying attention without pause. Around you, the room has resumed its ordinary motions, which is how households protect themselves from being overwhelmed by what they know. The sewing continues. The fire is watched. A child returns proud of a meaningless task. Someone asks where something has been set. Life, in other words, keeps going. But underneath it, you hold on to the sharper understanding the afternoon has offered. A Viking woman's world contains doors that later myths often forget. They are not wide. They are not easy. Yet their very presence changes the shape of the room. They mean that endurance here is not always mute. Sometimes it watches, waits, gathers its proofs, and remembers where the way back lies. By the time the men begin preparing to leave, the whole household changes its breathing. Not dramatically. No trumpet of importance. No grand speech at the doorway. That belongs more to later imagination than to ordinary life. The real change is subtler. A sharpened attention to what must be packed. A second look at weather. The checking and rechecking of things that were already checked once. A little more silence around the practical words. A little less patience for foolish delay. You feel it first in the way the room starts sorting men into departure and non-departure, as though the day itself were deciding who belongs to the shore and who remains tied to the house. A cloak is shaken out. A bundle is retied. A knife is tested against its sheath. Dried food is counted, then counted again with the quick irritation of someone who suspects optimism has crept into the numbers. Water, ale, rope, leather ties, spare cloth, whatever the journey requires and the household can spare. Even a short absence presses on stores differently once it becomes real. A longer one presses harder still. And whether the men are leaving for trade, fishing, travel between settlements, seasonal work or some more dangerous undertaking, the feeling inside the house is never only pride. That is one of the quieter truths daily life understands better than legend does. Departure creates absence, and absence creates labour for those who remain. If a husband, brother, son, or hired man goes by sea or road, someone else must account for the work no longer done by his hands. Fences still loosen, animals still need tending, stores still need guarding, children still grow hungry at the same hours. Whatever glory men may imagine outside the fjord, the household measures departure by the shape of the gap it leaves behind. You stand near the chest while one of the bundles is finely tied to satisfaction. The cord bites down, the cloth holds. Good, one less uncertainty, but the others remain. A man leaving by boat does not simply cross distance. He disappears into rumour, weather, chance, and whatever skill or foolishness he carries with him. This sea is not obliged to return him on schedule. Every woman who has lived near ships long enough knows this in her body, whether she says it aloud or not. Water has a way of making promises sound childish. So the room becomes practical. Too practical, perhaps, for sentiment to find much open space. An older woman reminds someone not to forget the smaller pouch. A younger one notices a seam that needs reinforcing before the cloak can be trusted. Someone asks about weather farther along the coast. Someone else dismisses the concern too quickly, which is its own form of worry. Men leaving often perform certainty more than they feel it. Women remaining often hide fear inside competence for exactly the same reason. You pass over the repaired garment without comment. He takes it without thanks at first, then glances back as though he knows better. That glance is enough. Affection in households like this is often carried through objects, not speeches. The better tied bundle, the stronger seam. The little store of food shifted into the bag without announcement. Care moves toward departure quietly, because quiet care is less humiliating for everyone involved. A child, too young to understand uncertainty and old enough to feel disruption, grows excited at the idea of boats and motion, and men going out into the wide world. The child asks too many questions. Will they come back tomorrow? Will they bring something? Will the sea be loud? The questions scatter into the room like pebbles. No one answers fully. No one lies boldly either. Adults in such houses learn the art of replying just enough. Outside, the air seems sharper now, as if departure has made the weather more visible. You can imagine the shoreline without seeing it. Wet wood, rope, cold wind, water knocking against hulls with that indifferent persistence only water has. Somewhere beyond the settlement, the route outward is already waiting. Inside, though, you're still counting what remains. Who will carry which work now? What must be delayed? What cannot be delayed? Which younger hands can be trusted more than before? Which stores must be watched more tightly if the absence stretches? The leaving has not happened yet, and already you are living in its consequences. That may be the most accurate measure of it. A man's departure begins for a woman long before the boat pushes off. It begins in inventory, in silence, in the altered weight of the house, and in the calm face she keeps while the day quietly rearranges itself around what might not return on time. When the men are gone, the silence they leave behind is never pure silence. It is a rearranged soundscape, fewer heavy steps, fewer voices crossing the room at once, more space at the bench, though not enough to feel generous. The longhouse seems, for a brief moment, to exhale, and then immediately to realise how much more carefully it must now breathe. You stand near the doorway after the last figure has gone out of sight, not because there is nothing to do, but because there is suddenly too much that depends on how well the rest of the day is handled. The younger ones still expect things at the same hour. The older ones still carry their habits, their moods, their needs. The animals do not grant a pause in honour of absence. Fire still has to be fed. Milk still turns if left too long. Cloth still waits for the hand that left it unfinished. A man's departure may look like movement from the shore. From the house, it looks like subtraction. And yet the room does not become smaller without men in it. In some ways it becomes larger, because your authority no longer has to move around their immediate presence. That change is not theatrical. It does not arrive as a crown or a proclamation. It arrives as a different kind of directness. Decisions made without first checking the mood of the men who have just gone. Tasks redistributed more cleanly. A younger helper spoken to not as a child to be managed, but as a pair of hands now needed in earnest. The household stretches into the absence and discovers the shape it must take to hold. You begin at once. A list forms in your mind so quickly it hardly feels like language. Check the stored dairy. Move the drying things before the weather shifts. Have the younger one bring in more fuel before dusk. Look again at the fence. Set aside what cannot be wasted. Count what remains of the grain more honestly now that fewer hands will eat here tonight. But more uncertainty has entered the future. All of it practical. All of it tinged with the fact that practical work is one of the oldest ways people keep fear from becoming visible. A child asks when they will come back. The question lands harder now because the room is quieter. You answer gently, but not foolishly. Soon, perhaps, when the work is done, if weather allows. The child listens, frowns, and accepts the answer only because children are used to adults naming uncertainty as though it were ordinary. In truth, it is ordinary. That is the uncomfortable part. In coastal and seafaring communities, uncertainty is not a disruption of life. It is part of its architecture. You move back toward the hearth and notice how quickly the room begins orienting itself toward you, not with ceremony, with habit. Someone asks where to place something. Someone else waits for your judgment about whether a garment should be mended now or later. The younger woman who'd been sewing glances up before speaking, as if confirming the room's centre, has shifted slightly and knows it. This too belongs to the historical truth of things. When men were away, women in Norse households could shoulder very substantial responsibility for managing property, labour, stores, servants or dependents, and the daily continuity of the farmstead. It would be false to call this equality. The legal and social order remains shaped by men in too many ways for that. But it would be equally false to pretend the woman left behind merely waits and weeps in decorative helplessness. Waiting is work when a household must continue. By late afternoon, the absence has become routine enough to stop announcing itself every few minutes, and that may be the strangest part. The room adapts. Human life always does. More quickly than pride would like to admit. A cup is no longer set out automatically. A familiar interruption does not come. A task once shared is simply done by someone else. Loss has not occurred, not exactly, but possibility has opened its cold hand, and the house has adjusted the furniture of daily life around it. You take up a garment left near the bench, fold it once, then decide against folding it, and set it aside instead. Perhaps he will want it when he returns. Perhaps not. The thought passes through you lightly enough to hide itself, heavily enough to stay. Outside, the day is already beginning to lean toward evening. The light has changed again. Thinner now, more silver at the edges. Inside, the fire gathers itself for the colder hours, and the house continues under your eye, under your management, under the quiet strain of uncertainty handled so often it has become nearly graceful. That may be one of the deepest truths about a Viking woman's life when men leave by sea or road. She's not simply abandoned to worry. She's left with command in a world that grants command unevenly. She is trusted because she must be, burdened because trust and burden so often travel together, and expected to transform absence into continuity before anyone has called it either heroic or hard. So you do what women in such houses have done countless times before. You keep the place alive until footsteps return to the door. A little later, when the house is steadier again, you take the path that leads beyond the yard and toward other people's thresholds. No one calls it going to market in the grand sense every time. Sometimes it is only exchange, a visit, a matter of cloth for butter, news for news, a favour remembered, a tool returned, a question answered with something tangible. But the path itself matters. It reminds you that a woman's life here is not sealed inside one longhouse, however much the work of that house tries to claim her entirely. The ground is damp in places, firmer in others, marked by wheels, feet, animals, weather and repetition. You know where it dips. You know where boards have been laid badly over softer ground. You know where another household keeps a dog that announces strangers as though it were defending a king's hall. Knowledge like this accumulates in the body. A path walked often enough becomes part memory, part expectation. You carry something useful with you. That too gives dignity to movement. A small wrapped piece of cloth, dairy, yarn, a request shaped into an object. A household rarely sends a woman out empty-handed if the visit concerns anything practical, and most visits concern something practical in the end. Even when talk begins with health, weather, kin, or the latest difficulty down by the shore, it often resolves into exchange. The Norse world moves goods through relationships as much as through formal stalls and measured bargains. As you near the other buildings, the settlement reveals itself in a different register than the longhouse ever can. Voices arrive detached from faces at first. The sound of someone splitting or shaping wood. A child running where a child has been told not to run. Smoke rising from more than one roof. A figure bent over some outdoor task, glancing up not from suspicion exactly, but from the lifelong habit of noticing who is approaching and why. You're noticed before you speak. That matters. So does how you are read. A woman out on household business is not invisible in this world. She carries the reputation of her people with her in small ways, in the neatness of what she brings, the tone she uses, whether she wastes time, whether she appears careless, whether she remembers what was said last season, whether she pays back one favour with another, instead of pretending memory belongs only to men. In a society where kinship and standing travel through daily dealings as much as through formal agreements, even a brief visit can do the work of diplomacy. The woman who receives you does not greet you with softness first. She greets you with measure. That is not coldness. It is competence meeting competence. Her eyes go to what you carry, then to your face, then back again, taking in enough to decide what kind of conversation this will be. Around her, the signs of her own day remain visible. Something drying, something waiting to be carried, a child half underfoot, the old familiar tension between welcome and interruption. Two working women meeting in daylight rarely step into a scene empty of prior obligations. You exchange the first words, nothing theatrical. A remark about weather, perhaps, about someone who has gone down to the water, about the quality of this season's whatever the moment requires. Wool, milk, fish, wood, labour, patience. The real subject arrives only after the outer layer has been properly handled. That is often how women's networks preserve both efficiency and pride. You do not lunge for the transaction. You give it somewhere social to stand. In later myths, the Viking world can appear too male, too public, too attached to ships and visible power to leave much room for women's movement beyond the home. But archaeology, graves, goods, and common sense all push against that simplification. Women could trade, travel locally, supervise exchange, carry goods, visit neighbouring households, and participate in the wider circulation that kept settlements functioning. Not all women equally, not in every region or status group in the same way, yet enough that the old image of total domestic confinement will not hold. You feel that truth most clearly here, not in any grand declaration, but in the ordinary competence of the meeting itself. A skein is examined, a dairy product judged, a question asked about whether more can be spared next week. Someone mentions that another household farther off has heard news from traders, and at once the world seems larger than the path under your shoes. Not abstractly larger, tangibly larger. Goods, rumours, marriages, seasonal shortages, metalwork, cloth, ship movement, kin disputes. They all travel, and women often help carry them. A child tugs at the other woman's sleeve and is gently moved aside without breaking the flow of exchange. You find yourself almost grateful for the matter-of-factness of it all. There is relief in being read as capable by another woman who understands exactly what capability costs. And as the conversation deepens, becoming at once more practical and more alive, you can feel the day opening outward beyond the longhouse walls. The household still anchors you. It always will. But here on this damp path between working homes with goods in your hands and memory doing half the bargaining, you step into another truth of Viking daily life. A woman may belong to a house without belonging only to it. By the time the exchange is underway, it is no longer clear where practical business ends and social knowledge begins. That is the real market, if one may call it that. Not merely goods changing hands, but judgments, memories, warnings, opportunities and obligations moving with them. A woman who steps out from her own household carries more than dairy, yarn, cloth, or a request. She carries her household steadiness. She brings its reliability into view, and in return she gathers the kind of information no chest can store neatly. The other woman turns the cloth in her hands with that swift, silent expertise working people recognize in one another. She does not praise it too quickly. Praise too quickly, and one risks sounding foolish or eager. Instead she tests. Weight, weave, soundness, whether it will endure use or only look respectable for a short while. You do the same with what she offers. No offence is taken. This is respect in its plainest form, assuming the other person knows enough to judge honestly. A child hovers nearby, listening to words half understood and patterns fully absorbed. Children learn exchange long before they learn terms for it. They learn that favours travel, that memory matters, that a promise does not vanish because the day becomes busy, that people who seem friendly can still count sharply, and people who count sharply can still be trusted. You ask after a man from another settlement who is expected to arrive with goods and has not yet appeared. The answer comes with a shrug that is more informed than careless. Weather. Delay. Perhaps he went first to a different landing place. Perhaps his goods were poorer than hoped and needed hiding behind excuses. The tone is dry. The meaning is not. This is how news arrives here. Incomplete, practical, shaped by those who handled it before it reached you. Women's conversations often preserve that ambiguity better than public boasting does. They leave room for uncertainty because uncertainty is usually what life offers. A little farther off, two younger people move sacks or baskets between buildings, watched by an older man who contributes less labour than opinion. The scene lasts only a few moments, but it tells its own story about work, age, and who gets to supervise with clean hands. You notice it, and so does the woman with you. Neither of you comments directly. A glance is enough. That glance matters. For all the formal weight men may carry in law, inheritance, assembly, and feud, much of the texture of real daily life still passes through women observing one another and the world around them. Who is coping? Who is short on stores? Who is treating a daughter well? Which household is growing careless? Whose son drinks too hard? Whose animals look thin? Which marriage seems sound from a distance and strained up close? This is not idle gossip in its emptiest form. It is social intelligence, sometimes unkind, often necessary. You shift the bundle in your arms and speak of the men who left earlier. The woman nods without surprise. Of course they did. Men leave, boats go, roads pull, fish move, trade calls. The whole north is threaded through with absences. She asks, not sentimentally, whether you have enough hands left for what remains. That is the right question. Not are you worried, though worry exists. Not do you miss them, though perhaps you do. But do you have enough hands? In that one question sits the practical heart of the matter. You answer honestly, though not dramatically. Enough for now. More or less. We will manage. This kind of understatement is one of the oldest forms of courage. The exchange is settled at last with no flourish. One thing for another. A promise for later. A note of who owes what, not written down, because the ledger is shared memory, and the cost of forgetting is reputation. In worlds like this, trust is rarely pure feeling, it is repeated proof. The woman you deal with may be warm to you, may even like you, but trust grows because goods arrive when promised, because measures are fair enough, because one household does not pretend not to remember what the other provided in winter. Before you leave, the talk drifts once more beyond objects and into rumour. Someone has heard of traders bringing foreign goods farther along the coast. Someone else has heard of trouble in a district inland. A possible marriage, a dispute, a shortage. A lucky season for some and not for others. The wider Viking world begins to flicker around the edges of the conversation, not as a saga, but as fragments carried home in practical voices. That, perhaps, is how large worlds are really experienced by most people, not through epic perspective, but through bits of cloth, changed prices, delayed arrivals, and the look on another woman's face when she says things are harder this year than last. When you finally turn back toward your own path, what you carry is a little heavier than what you brought. Not only in goods, you carry revised expectations, a better sense of the season, a fresh awareness of who is steady, who is stretched, and who may soon need something they will be too proud to ask for directly. You carry the strange comfort of having stood for a little while in another woman's work shadow and been understood there without ceremony. And as your feet find the familiar ruts and boards again, you feel more clearly than before that a Viking woman's world is not made only of the tasks inside her own walls. It is made also of crossings between households, of exchange thick with memory, of small negotiations through which the settlement holds together. The path home is the same as the path out, but you do not walk it with the same knowledge. By the time you return, the light has begun its slow turn toward evening, and the children feel it before anyone else. Adults measure late day by shadows, unfinished tasks, the cooling air, the distance still left between now and sleep. Children measure it by something more immediate. Their patience frays, their hunger reappears in a new shape, small injuries become tragedies, questions multiply. A quiet room can turn wild in a handful of breaths if no one catches the mood early enough. You feel that shift the moment you step back inside. A younger child is sitting where the floor is warmest near the hearth, absorbed in some tiny occupation that seems solemn, only because childhood can make anything solemn. Another is too tired to settle and too proud to admit it. A third is watching the older people with the sharp, secretive attention children use when trying to understand rules nobody has properly explained to them. The room is full of that peculiar late-day energy, less noisy than morning hunger, more fragile than mid-morning restlessness. You set your bundle down and begin sorting what has come back with you, but your attention keeps moving toward the children even while your hands stay with the goods. That is how much of child rearing works here. Not as a separate sacred task set apart from labour, but braided through labour so completely that the two are almost impossible to untangle. A woman teaches while stirring, while mending, while walking, while checking stores, while calming one child and correcting another. Care and instruction travel in the same motions. The older child asks what you brought, not because the answer matters so much, but because returned objects mean the wider world has touched the household and come back carrying clues. You show only what can be shown. A little cloth, something exchanged, nothing exciting enough to turn the evening into begging or boasting. Still, the child studies each thing as though it might reveal how adulthood works. In a sense, it does. Adults return with burdens, obligations, and measured gain. Children see only the object first. The meaning comes later. One of the younger ones has gotten hold of a spindle whorl and is treating it as a toy until you take it away before it chips or vanishes. There is disappointment naturally, and then the brief injustice all children know when a grown person removes delight in the name of practical sense. You answer that injustice with a task. Bring the small basket, fold the cloth, sit here, not there. Children in a household like this are seldom invited into idleness for long. Even play often leans toward imitation, toward preparation, toward the shapes of future usefulness. And yet there is affection here too, unmistakable in the very fact of such attention. You tuck a loose wrap around one small shoulder without breaking conversation. You wipe a nose with more patience than elegance. You hear the beginning of a quarrel between siblings and cut it off not because it is wicked, but because everyone is too tired for the noise to remain harmless. A child's world in a Viking household is not soft in the modern sense. There is work, expectation, weather, danger, proximity, discipline. But neither is it loveless by default. Tenderness simply wears practical clothing. Near the wall, an older child is trying to help, and trying, at the same time, not to look as though help still needs to be learned. That age can be difficult, no longer little enough to be forgiven everything, not yet old enough to command respect without effort. You let the child carry out something real, not a pretend task this time, not because you are generous, though perhaps you are. Because households survive by letting children grow into responsibility gradually enough that the burden does not arrive all at once like a blow. Memory enters here as well. A woman teaches children not only how to carry, fetch, mend, stir, and watch the fire. She also teaches who belongs to them and how, which names matter, which kin live beyond the next path, which old stories of the family are worth telling again, which grudges are remembered, which losses are spoken carefully. In cultures shaped strongly by oral memory, a mother or senior woman often becomes one of the first keepers of continuity. Not the only one, certainly, but an essential one. A child learns the map of the world partly by learning who the household says it is. The child nearest the hearth asks some question too large for the hour, perhaps about where the men have gone, perhaps about whether a person far away is truly kin, perhaps about why one household has more than another. These are evening questions, the kind that rise when work slows enough for curiosity to find a gap. You answer simply, not falsely simple, just enough. That is another old skill. Children must be given the world in pieces they can carry. Too much truth at once crushes. Too little leaves them foolish. Outside, the air has thinned into that colder clarity which means night will not take long once it commits itself. Inside, the children are beginning to gather closer to the centre of warmth, drawn by fire, tiredness, and the half-unconscious instinct to move toward protection as the light fades. And as you watch them, correcting one, trusting another, soothing a third, already measuring what they will need before sleep, you understand how much of a Viking woman's day stretches forward into the future through children's bodies and habits. You're not only keeping them alive until morning, you're helping shape what kind of adults this hard world will one day receive from your hands. As the evening deepens, the children begin to drift towards stories without ever quite asking for them outright. That too is a habit of shared houses. No one announces that it is now time for instruction or memory. The day simply softens at the edges. Hands continue working, but more slowly. A seam can be mended while a voice speaks. Wool can be teased apart while a child leans closer. A bowl can be scraped clean while names from before the child's birth are spoken again into the room, as if the dead, the absent and the distant all remain loosely seated among the living so long as someone keeps saying who they were. You settle near the fire with enough work in your lap to make the moment feel earned. That matters. Too much stillness can make children restless, as if the room itself has slipped out of order. But work paired with speech creates a steadier kind of attention. The youngest one inches closer until a knee presses against your side. Another lies half-curled under a wrap, pretending not to listen, and listening to every word. The older child keeps trying to look beyond stories now, as though already suspicious that childhood can be escaped by expression alone. You begin with something small, not a grand tale of kings or the loud sort of saga later centuries love best, but the kind of household memory that teaches while seeming merely to recall. Who lived at the next farm before winter took him? Which aunt was known for never wasting cloth? Why a certain chest is treated carefully? How one summer the fish came late, and everyone learned the difference between wanting and having. These are not heroic stories in the polished sense, but they are the ones that tell a child what this world rewards, what it punishes, what it remembers. In cultures like this, where writing does not carry the whole burden of memory, women's voices inside the home become part of how continuity survives. A child may hear law and reputation discussed among men, hear boasts, bargains, kin claims, and public history shaped elsewhere. But the inner map of daily belonging is often taught by women, who your people are, what kind of people they are supposed to be, and what kind of shame or pride attaches to ordinary choices, the youngest interrupts with a question that bends the whole room slightly toward laughter. Not because the question is foolish, but because children always reach for the literal edge of things. If an uncle once got lost in fog, did the fog choose him? If grandmother hid a better loaf from greedy hands, was that stealing? If a woman from another farm came back to her own kin, was her old bed still waiting? Children have a talent for stepping directly onto the joints of adult truth. You answer carefully. Carefully because children deserve honesty, but not the full cold weight of it before sleep. So you let humour take some of the strain. The fog chooses no one. A hidden loaf is not theft if it keeps winter from becoming foolish. A bed may wait, or it may have to be made new. The room accepts these answers because they are near enough to truth to hold, and gentle enough not to bruise. One of the older women adds a line of her own from across the room, dry as ever, and the children look toward her as if a carved figure had suddenly spoken. That is another part of education here. Wisdom does not always arrive wrapped in softness. Sometimes it comes in short sentences that sound almost severe and live in the mind for years afterward. The fire lowers a little. Someone adjusts a log. Sparks rise and vanish. Outside, the wind touches the walls and moves on. Inside, the children grow heavier with sleep in the way children do. Not all at once, but in visible stages. The questions slow. The hands stop fidgeting. One child leans harder than before. Another gives in and rests a head against folded wool. You continue speaking, more softly now. At this hour, instruction changes its form. It is no longer only about tasks or manners or usefulness. It is about making the world seem coherent enough for children to rest inside it. Not harmless. No parent in a Viking household could honestly promise that. But coherent, named, held together by kin, memory, caution, and the repeated assurance that someone older has seen hard things before and still knows how evening is supposed to sound. That may be one of the most intimate duties a woman carries, not simply feeding or clothing children, vital though those are, but giving shape to uncertainty so it does not devour them too early. The world outside the walls contains cold, absence, bad luck, hard men, shifting alliances, poor harvests, dangerous water, and every other old trouble. Yet the child nearest the fire need not be handed all of that raw. It can be filtered first through story, rhythm, naming, and the calm presence of someone whose hands are still busy even while her voice makes order. By the time the last answer trails off, the room has become quieter than anyone consciously intended. A younger child is asleep. The older one is near enough to it not to deny. Even those still awake have softened. Around you, the longhouse feels, for a brief and precious stretch, less like a machine of labour than like a circle of breath and shadow held together by memory. And as you look down at the small faces turned toward warmth, toward kin, toward sleep, you feel one of the gentlest truths of this life settle into place. A Viking woman does not only raise children through discipline and work, she raises them through atmosphere, through repetition, through stories that teach them who they are before the harsher parts of the world try to answer first. As the children settle and the room loosens its grip on the day, attention turns almost without announcement to bodies again. Not in the blunt way of mourning, when clothing must be fastened and tasks begun before the fire has fully recovered. Evening asks for a gentler kind of order. Dirt noticed now that haste has eased. Hair retied, hands rinsed, faces wiped, a comb found and passed, clothing shaken, checked, hung where smoke and warmth may do what they can. The house, after spending the day enduring work, begins preparing itself to look human again. You sit near the better light and take up the comb once more. It catches faintly in your hair, tugging out the day. Smoke, wool dust, a little sweat dried at the roots, perhaps a strand of hay or fleece you had not noticed until now. The feeling is oddly satisfying, not luxurious exactly, but restorative. A body that has been used all day becomes legible to itself again through these small acts. That matters more than people later often understand. Too many modern fantasies treat the Viking world as if roughness were a virtue in itself, as though grime proved authenticity and neglect proved toughness. But the evidence points somewhere more interesting. Combs are common finds. Tweezers, ear spoons, razors, washing habits, concern for appearance. None of this belongs to a people indifferent to grooming. They lived in demanding conditions, yes, but they were not blind to presentation. Cleanliness and self-respect were not foreign ideas washed away by weather. Across the room, another woman is doing much the same with a child whose eyelids are already threatening sleep. The child submits with theatrical suffering, as children do when being made presentable for no audience they can appreciate. You almost smile. Every era has its little domestic indignities. You set the comb aside briefly and pour a little water into a basin. Not enough to be generous. Water has weight. Water has to be carried. Water answers to labour before it answers to comfort. But enough are hands, perhaps the face, perhaps the parts of the skin most marked by soot and the day's contact with work. You dip the cloth, wring it, and feel the coolness strike the fingers first, then the face. The sensation wakes you while also softening something in you. A day can cling to the body more heavily than the mind admits. The older woman near the hearth gives a disapproving glance towards someone whose hands are still blackened where they need not be. She says nothing. She does not have to. In close households, standards can be enforced by silence as effectively as by scolding. There is dignity in not looking neglected. There is also social meaning in it. Clean hair, ordered clothing, a face not entirely claimed by smoke or grease. These are not trivial vanities. They affect how others read your household, your competence, your marriage prospects if you're young, your seriousness if you're not. You smooth the cloth over your wrists and think of how strange it is that cleanliness must be worked toward in a world so shaped by mud, soot, animal life, cold, and crowded quarters. Strange, but not contradictory. That is true of many things here. A hard world does not prevent people from caring about neatness. Sometimes it deepens the desire. The more life exposes you to mess and weather, the more meaningful small restoration becomes. A combed head, a fresh apron, a clean pair of hands before eating or sleeping, even the great stereotype of Vikings as universally filthy, collapses under the weight of ordinary objects. People do not make and carry grooming tools for amusement alone. A younger woman asks where the smaller comb has gone. You answer without looking, because of course you know. It was set near the chest after the last use, not there. Then beneath the folded cloth where someone placed it absent-mindedly and trusted memory to do the rest. It is found. Another small domestic near-disaster averted before it becomes irritation. The room is full of such moments now. A sleeve brushed, a loose braid redone, a child's face wiped with more firmness than grace, a bit of linen checked, brooches loosened, shoes pulled off and set where they can dry rather than sour. None of this would seem worthy of saga, yet together they reveal something the louder records of history often miss. People wanted to end the day as people, not merely as workers collapsed where they fell. You lift the comb again and draw it through your hair more slowly this time. The firelight catches the motion. So does the gaze of the younger girl nearby, who watches not because combing is rare, but because womanhood is learned through repetition. How to care for the body without wasting precious things. How to preserve appearance without pretending labour does not exist. How to remain orderly in a world always trying to undo order by nightfall. These too are lessons. And as the room gradually turns from work toward rest, you can feel another quiet truth taking shape. Grooming in a Viking household is not a separate luxury added after real life is done. It is part of real life, part of dignity, part of how a woman restores the self that the day has spent. As the evening settles more fully, grooming becomes less about being seen and more about returning the body to itself. The brooches come loose first. There is always a small relief in that. The weight at the chest has done its work for the day. The belt follows, with its familiar downward pull suddenly gone, leaving the body feeling lighter and, for a moment, oddly unfinished. Things that signalled readiness in the morning now signal permission to soften. Not abandon order entirely, this house never allows that, but loosen it enough for night. You fold each piece with the care of someone who knows clothing has a longer memory than people often do. A badly placed garment wrinkles, stretches, picks up damp, or vanishes under the feet of those who wake first. A well-kept one meets you more kindly in the morning. Even at day's end, tomorrow is already being prepared. Near the hearth, one of the older women has taken up a smaller blade and is trimming away a stubborn loose thread from a cuff. Another cleans beneath a fingernail with the narrow-minded focus tired people bring to tiny repairs. Across the room, a child is having ears wiped with the exaggerated misery reserved for chores that feel both intimate and unnecessary. The room would be comical if it were not so familiar. You rinse your hands again. The water is cooler now against the skin, and the sensation sends a little wakefulness up the arms. Soot lifts, dust loosens. The fine residue of wool, ash, milk, earth, and tools goes reluctantly, leaving behind hands that still look worked, but no longer look entirely claimed by the day. That distinction matters. No one here expects softness untouched by labour, but there is comfort in not carrying every trace of effort into sleep. A younger girl is still watching how the women around her manage these last rituals. She watches who folds and who tosses, who checks seams even now and who leaves such things to tomorrow, who wipes the child's face properly despite complaint, who lets a comb pass without first clearing the teeth. These small habits become character in the eyes of a household, not because anyone delivers a sermon on neatness, but because repetition turns preference into reputation. A careless girl becomes, in time, a careless woman in other people's mouths. A careful one earns a steadier future long before anyone says so directly. That can sound harsh. Often it is. Yet it is also one reason such households remain observant about appearance even in hard conditions. Orderliness is read as capacity. Cleanliness, within the limits of water, season and work, becomes a sign not merely of taste but of self-command. Outside, darkness has deepened enough that the doorway now frames mostly blackness, with a thinning border of late light. Inside, the fire carries the visual burden of the room. It lays gold on cheeks, copper on hair, and shadow into every fold of hanging cloth. In this light, even the most ordinary gestures begin to seem intimate. A woman unwinding her braid, another rubbing a child's feet dry, a hand checking the dryness of shoes set near warmth. The room, so public all day, becomes private by degrees without ever truly becoming private at all. You shake out the outer garment once before setting it aside. A faint smell rises from it. Smoke, cold air, animal warmth, the outdoors, the house itself. It is strange how much of a place can cling to cloth. Tomorrow it will go on your body again, carrying some trace of tonight into another round of work. Nothing here is fully separate. Rest prepares labour. Labour stains rest. Care lives in both directions. The older woman nearest the hearth says something brief about washing when one can because people notice when one does not. The remark is dry, almost offhand, but it lands with the force of shared truth. People did notice. Viking-age societies were not blind to smell, order or presentation, merely because life was rugged. A cared-for appearance could shape attraction, respectability, and social standing. Even in the archaeology, the persistence of grooming tools argues against the lazy old image of indifference. You draw the comb one last time through your hair and begin braiding it more loosely for the night. The movement slows you. So does the fire. So does the hush falling over the children. The house is not yet asleep, but it has stopped pushing outward. It gathers inward now, toward warmth, toward habit, toward the repetitive mercies that make another day possible. And perhaps that is the deepest comfort hidden in these small evening rituals. They do not erase hardship. They do not deny the coarseness of work or the uncertainty beyond the walls, but they restore proportion. They remind each person in the room that they are not only hands for labour or bodies for endurance. They are human beings who prefer clean faces to dirty ones, combed hair to tangled hair, mended cloth to frayed cloth, and a little order before darkness fully takes the house. So when you finally set the comb aside and let your shoulders sink, what settles over you is not vanity satisfied, but something quieter and more durable. The day has used you. These careful motions help give you back. By the time the children are nearly asleep and the room is softened into firelight and low voices, the older habits of belief begin to show themselves. not as spectacle, not as the kind of dramatic ritual later ages like to paint onto every shadowed room. Belief here is usually quieter than that, more woven into daily caution, inherited gesture, remembered words, things done because they have always been done, and because nobody with sense feels eager to test what happens if they are not. A woman living in this world does not divide life neatly into ordinary tasks on one side and the sacred on the other. The two keep brushing against each other all day. You feel it now in the way one object is set down more carefully than another, in the little pause before a threshold is crossed, in the lowered voice when certain possibilities are named, in the half-joking warning given to a child not to speak too boldly of things unseen once darkness has settled. The room itself invites such thoughts. Firelight narrows the world and deepens what remains. The rafters disappear upward into dimness. The edges of the house become less certain. Wind touches the outer wall like a hand testing it. The ordinary tools of daylight, spindle, pot, comb, chest, cup, seem changed without changing at all. Night does that. It does not make people foolish, but it does remind them that much of life depends on forces no hand can hold steady forever. Weather, illness, fertility, luck, return, death, the moods of men, the moods of the sea, the harvest, the hidden shape of winter. A woman near the hearth murmurs something over a task so small it might not deserve words, except that the words are not for the task alone. Perhaps it is habit, perhaps blessing, perhaps only an old phrase spoken because the room feels more orderly when it is spoken. In Viking Age life, religion and ritual were not always grand public performances. Much of belief lived domestically, in seasonal practice, in household caution, in offerings, in memory, in the sense that prosperity and disaster were never entirely human-made. You adjust something near the fire, a pot, a cloth, a piece of wood, and think of how often women likely stood close to these smaller thresholds between safety and danger. Food spoils or keeps. Children thrive or fail. Men leave and return, or do not. Animals birth well or badly. Stores endure winter or thin too early. And because so much remains uncertain, people build patterns around uncertainty. Some are practical and visible. Others lean toward the sacred. A woman might watch omens without calling them omens. She might note a run of bad luck without pretending it means nothing. She might remember which season brought sorrow, which feast brought relief, which old custom is still followed not because everyone can explain it, but because history often survives first as habit. Across the Norse world, women appear in the surviving record not only as household workers, wives and mothers, but sometimes also in relation to ritual knowledge and spiritual authority. Later texts and archaeological hints make the picture complicated, never neat. One must be careful. Not every woman was a seeress. Not every household act was a ceremony. Yet it would also be wrong to imagine spiritual life as belonging only to male spaces. Women helped carry belief through the home, through memory, through the practical and emotional management of uncertain lives. The child nearest the fire shifts in sleep and mutters once. Someone draws a wrap more firmly over small shoulders. No one speaks for a few moments after that. In the quiet, the house feels full of more than the visible. Not ghosts, not inventions, not some theatrical haunting. Only the dense company of dependence and memory. The sense that this room is linked to those who built it. Those who slept here before. Those who kept this same fire going through other winters, other births, other losses. A household is never only a present tense place. It is thick with the people it remembers and the customs it continues without always naming why. You notice the older woman touch a hanging object almost absent-mindedly as she passes, not quite reverence, not quite habit alone. That kind of gesture is hard to classify and easy to underestimate. Much of ancient belief leaves exactly this kind of trace, gestures too small for monuments, too ordinary for formal record, yet repeated enough to reveal what the room trusted when certainty ran thin. Outside, night has taken the settlement now. The dark beyond the doorway is no longer evening. It is full night, and everyone inside feels it whether they look up or not. That changes how voices move. They lower, they round off. Even practical remarks take on a little more care, as though night itself were listening. And as you sit in that gathering hush, with firelight breathing and the children slipping deeper into sleep, you begin to understand one of the gentler truths of a Viking woman's spiritual world. It is not built only from gods named in stories or rituals remembered in fragments. It is built also from daily uncertainty met with steadiness, from old forms preserved inside ordinary acts, and from the quiet refusal to live as though human effort were the only force shaping the days. Later, when the fire has burned lower, and the room no longer belongs to work in quite the same way, belief takes on a more intimate shape, not larger, smaller, and in some ways more powerful for that. Someone checks the doorway bar one more time. Someone else glances toward the roof opening as if measuring the night by the smoke. A cup is set down carefully, not because it is precious, but because care itself feels like a form of respect at this hour. Nothing here looks like grand ritual, and yet the room is full of little acts that say the same thing. Darkness is not treated as empty. A younger woman asks, half lightly, whether the weather will hold through tomorrow. No one answers immediately. Weather is never only weather in a life like this. It governs travel, drying, fodder, fishing, mood, safety, return. A careless answer would sound like arrogance. So the older woman nearest the hearth only shrugs and says that tomorrow will show itself soon enough. It is a practical answer, but underneath it lies the old recognition that human beings may prepare, watch, judge, and still not command what matters most. That recognition has consequences. It makes people less likely to boast at night. It makes them repeat old customs even when they could not defend them in an argument. It makes women, especially women responsible for households, attentive to patterns others might dismiss too quickly. A run of sick animals, a child not thriving, milk turning strangely, a bad season following some neglected duty. No sensible person needs to become theatrical to feel the weight of such things. Belief in this world often lives not in spectacle, but in what people hesitate to ignore. You sit with your hands resting for one of the first times all day, and the stillness feels almost suspicious. That too is part of evening. A body used to constant motion does not relax cleanly at first. It listens for the next interruption. A child crying, a pot shifting, a knock, a footstep outside. When none come at once, the room acquires a peculiar tenderness, as though everyone inside has been granted a short loan of peace and does not wish to spend it noisily. Across from you, the older woman begins speaking of a season long ago when signs of trouble were noticed too late. Not signs in the foolish sense, not ravens arranged like prophecy, only ordinary things failing in a row until no one could pretend coincidence was still harmless. The story is told without ornament. That is what makes it persuasive. She remembers who dismissed concern, who paid attention, who kept stores better than the others, who thought luck alone would carry them. By the time she finishes, the lesson has taken shape without ever being announced as a lesson. The world gives warnings, but not in forms that flatter human pride. A woman responsible for a house learns to live close to such warnings. She notices the tone of the animals, the change in the wind, the feel of grain between finger and thumb, the uneasy silence of a child, the unsettling run of small mishaps that may mean nothing and may mean the season is turning against the household. Whether one calls that practical wisdom, spiritual caution, or simply old experience hardly matters in the moment. The result is the same. She lives attentively. She cannot afford not to. This is why belief and daily management are so difficult to separate in the Viking world. A woman may keep a house through labour, but she also keeps it through interpretation. She reads weather, temper, timing, luck, memory, and inherited custom together, because real life does not present these categories separately. The same hand that checks the fire may also repeat a phrase passed down from older women. The same woman who judges whether a store jar has spoiled may also feel that certain times of year ask for more care, more restraint, more observance than others. That is not foolishness. It is what life often becomes when survival depends on respect for what cannot be fully controlled. The fire shifts. A red seam opens in the wood and closes again. Somewhere beyond the wall a dog barks once, then stops. The room listens without admitting it is listening. Then slowly, as nothing worse follows, everyone returns to the quiet business of night. A wrap adjusted, a cup moved aside, a child lifted just enough to settle more deeply into sleep. The sacred, if it is here, does not arrive like thunder. It lives in this merging of caution, memory, reverence, fatigue, and repetition. It lives in the way women sustain a household not only with food and cloth, but with atmosphere. An atmosphere in which the unseen is neither mocked nor indulged, only given its proper place at the edge of the known. And as you sit there in the dimming warmth, feeling the day finally loosen its hold without quite releasing you, you understand that a Viking woman's spiritual world is not separate from the ordinary world at all. It is the ordinary world, listened to more carefully. By deep evening, when the fire has steadied into a lower, more dependable glow, the room begins revealing what hardship really looks like when nobody's performing it. Not heroism, not the bright, noisy struggle that later stories admire because it can be seen from a distance. Hardship in a household like this is quieter. It lives in the counting, in the saving back, in the way eyes go to the door when the wind sharpens, in how carefully the remaining fuel is judged, in the slight pause before someone serves one more portion and decides whether there is enough left to be generous. If winter is near, or already pressing, then every ordinary action acquires a second meaning. Not just what is needed now, but what can still be spared later. You feel that shift in the room tonight. The food is simpler than anyone would wish if wishes governed anything. The warmth, though welcome, does not travel evenly. Near the fire there is relief. At the edges of the room, cold waits with patience. A draught finds its way along the floor. Someone pulls a wrap tighter without comment. Another shifts nearer the centre, but tries not to look as if they are claiming privilege. Even comfort is negotiated here. This is one of the hardest truths to keep honest in telling. A Viking household could know abundance at times, skill, beauty, laughter, strong social bonds, even a certain rough prosperity. But it could also live one poor season away from strain. The farther north, the harsher the climate, the thinner the margin, the more clearly daily life became a conversation with scarcity. Not constant starvation, as crude fantasy sometimes suggests. More often a continual awareness that plenty is temporary and misjudgment has a long memory. You bed near the stores again, checking not because anything has changed since earlier, but because evening makes people count differently. By firelight, stores look both more reassuring and more fragile. A chest seems solid until you imagine the months ahead. A hanging piece of preserved food looks sufficient until you begin dividing it across days, across mouths, across illness, across bad weather, across the possibility that the men return late or not at all. This is what endurance often is, not stoic posing, but arithmetic performed under emotional pressure. The older woman says little, though you can tell from the way she handles things that she is counting too. Women who have seen more winters do that. They touch an object and feel not only what it is, but how long it must last. A younger person may see a stack. An older one sees a calendar made of hunger avoided or invited. Near the hearth, a child half wakes and asks drowsily for more. The answer is gentle, but no. That no contains the whole season. Children do not understand rationing as morality. They experience it as denial, and perhaps that is merciful. Let them feel the unfairness before they learn the fear. Still, even a refusal given softly leaves a mark on the room. It reminds everyone that care is not always sweetness. Sometimes care is measured with holding. Sometimes love sounds like enough. Outside, wind moves more insistently along the walls now, and you hear the house respond with small wooden sighs. Timber shifts. Thatch or turf answers the weather in its own language. The entire structure seems to remind you that shelter is not an idea. It is a maintained achievement. A weak seam in the roof, a gap left untended, insufficient fuel, wet bedding, spoiled stores. Any one of these can turn discomfort into genuine danger once cold settles in for real. You draw a blanket more securely over the sleeping children and notice how thin the line is between tenderness and strategy. Keep them warm, keep them from waking, keep them from burning more energy than they need. Keep the household quiet enough that sleep can do part of the work food cannot. Hard seasons teach people to think this way without ever saying so out loud. Across the north, women carried a large share of that hidden burden. They preserved food, watched stores, managed textile work, controlled household flow, cared for the vulnerable, and often absorbed the emotional weather of scarcity before others named it. Men might meet danger outside in visible forms. Women often met it indoors in slower ones. Thinning provisions, tired children, anxious elders, the impossible task of making everyone feel secure when certainty is not available to distribute. No one in the room gives a speech about resilience. They simply go on. A seam is mended, a bowl is scraped clean, ash is adjusted, fuel is saved where it can be saved. Someone says something dry enough to draw the faintest laugh, because even strain becomes easier to carry when not every sentence admits how much it weighs. That may be another form of endurance, refusing to let difficulty turn the whole house solemn. You sit back for a moment and let the fire warm your hands again, though not for long. Already you're thinking ahead to morning, to what remains, to how the next day will have to be shaped if this season is to be met without disgrace or panic. And as the longhouse settles around you under the pressure of darkened weather and limited stores, you come closer to the real emotional texture of a Viking woman's life in hard times. Not grand suffering, not dramatic collapse, but the long discipline of making enough feel like enough, and doing it so calmly that the others can still sleep. Later still, when most of the room has gone quiet, hardship takes on its most private form. Not hunger exactly, though hunger may be near. Not cold exactly, though the cold remains. What settles in now is fatigue, the kind that does not arrive as drama, but as a slow stealing away of brightness from everything familiar. A woman can endure a great deal in motion. There is dignity in tasks, in lifting, stirring, mending, checking, deciding. Action keeps fear from spreading too far into thought. But when the tasks thin out and the house grows dim and the children finally stop asking for things, the day leaves behind its deeper residue. You feel it in your back first, then in your hands, then in the part of the mind that has been counting all day and would very much like just for an hour to stop. Across the room, the older woman has fallen into that stillness, which is not quite sleep, not quite wakefulness either. Age and hard seasons teach people to rest lightly. A younger woman nearby is sewing one last thing by firelight, even though the light is no longer good enough for honesty. That, too, is a kind of truth. Work goes on past wisdom sometimes, because stopping feels more frightening than continuing. You know better than to waste the fire on perfect comfort. So the wood is adjusted carefully, not generously. Enough to carry the room into night. Not enough to flatter anyone into thinking tomorrow's fuel may spend itself tonight. This is what endurance looks like when it has matured past bravado. It does not make scenes. It refuses waste. One of the children stirs and coughs once in sleep. Every adult ear in the room hears it, even if no one moves immediately. That is another burden women often carry most deeply in such households. The constant readiness for small trouble to become larger trouble. A cough, a pale face, an animal gone off its feed, damp creeping into stored things, a pain someone dismisses until it begins shaping the whole day. Hard lives do not always break through spectacular events. More often they narrow through accumulation. One inconvenience, then another, then another. By the time anyone names the season difficult, the difficulty has already been living in the room for weeks. You pull another wrap over the child and smooth it once, lightly, so as not to wake them. The motion is tender. It is also practical. In this world, the line between tenderness and management is very thin. Perhaps it must be. Outside, the wind has settled into a steadier voice now, less restless than before, more certain. The house answers with faint sounds of its own, timber shifting, thatch or turf holding, the old low language of a structure asked to do its duty through another night. You listen without quite meaning to, measuring those sounds the way you measure everything else. A good house speaks differently from a failing one. Women who keep households learn that grammar early. A younger hand reaches for a stored bit of food and stops before touching it. as though remembering at the last moment that evening hunger does not always deserve to be answered. You notice and say nothing. Some lessons are better absorbed in silence. The hand withdraws. Pride is preserved. So is the food. That may be one of the lonelier aspects of endurance. How often it must remain invisible to work properly. A woman who judges well prevents scenes that never happen. Children do not know what was saved back for them. Men returning later may not know how narrowly things were managed while they were gone. Even other women in the room may see only the calm surface unless they have practiced the same calm themselves. Competence can become a kind of concealment, and yet there is dignity in that concealment too. Not because suffering should be hidden for its own sake, but because there is strength in refusing to let difficulty dictate the whole emotional weather of the house. Someone murmurs something dry and wry from near the hearth. Another woman answers with the ghost of a laugh. The sound is soft, almost unbelieving, but it changes the room. Hardship has not left. It has simply been denied the last word for the night. You sit for one more moment with your hands near the low fire, feeling the warmth reach only part way into the cold stored in your fingers. Around you, the longhouse has grown still enough that each sleeping breath seems to belong to the same creature. The house is poor in some things, strained in others, uncertain in many, but it is holding. And perhaps that is the most honest image of endurance a Viking woman would recognize. Not triumph, not collapse. A house still holding. Children asleep. Stores not yet gone. Fire not yet out. Your own tired body still upright long enough to make sure morning will have something to begin from. By the time the room has nearly surrendered itself to night, the day begins to gather into meaning without anyone naming that meaning aloud. This is often how truth arrives in a life like yours here. Not as revelation, not as a speech, but as the slow recognition that everything repeated from dawn to darkness has been saying the same things in different forms. Fire, food, cloth, children, weather, keys, stores, talk, silence, absence, caution, care. Each seemed at first like only itself. By night they begin to settle into a pattern. You sit close enough to the hearth to feel its remaining warmth, though not so close that you forget how quickly warmth fades once the fire is left alone. Around you, the longhouse has taken on that final stillness which is never total stillness. A sleeper turning, someone sighing, a log shifting inward, the faint murmur of wind outside, the sleepy restlessness of a child not yet fully surrendered to dreams. The house is not silent. It is resting in layers, the same way it woke in layers. Your hands are finally empty. That may be the strangest sensation of all. All day they have held something. Wood, grain, wool, cloth, milk, tools, cups, children, cords, combs, lids, work, work, work. Now they rest in your lap, and because they rest, the mind begins one last circuit through what was done and what still remains undone. The fence will need another look tomorrow. The cloth at the loom will not finish itself. The stores must be checked again. The younger child's cough may mean nothing or may need watching. More fuel should be brought closer if the weather turns sharper. The list does not vanish because darkness has come. It simply goes quieter. And underneath the quiet, another knowledge settles. The famous Viking world that later ages remember in iron, ships, silver, and sudden violence has depended all this time on rooms like this one, on women like this one, on days exactly like this day, repeated not once but across years, across settlements, across seasons, across lives that never expected to be remembered individually. That is not a sentimental thought. It is structural. Without the long labour of women, the household does not hold. Without the household holding, the farm does not endure. Without endurance, the wider world men boast about becomes much smaller, much sooner than anyone likes to admit. A child near the hearth gives a small sleeping sound and curls more tightly into the blanket. You look down and feel the old mix of things that refuses simple naming. Tenderness, yes. Fatigue, certainly. Responsibility so constant it no longer feels like a separate burden, only like the shape of your own existence. You have fed, measured, carried, corrected, repaired, judged, soothed, watched, exchanged, remembered and prepared. None of it would look extraordinary from outside. That may be exactly why it matters so much. Across the room, in the low light, the older woman's face seems carved almost out of shadow and ember glow. You can imagine suddenly how many nights like this she's already seen, how many winters counted through, how many children watched, how many absences absorbed, how many small domestic disasters prevented before they could become stories. There is something almost sobering in that thought. A woman's life here is not built from one grand turning point. It is built from accumulation, 1,000 acts of steadiness shaping what everyone else later mistakes for normal life. Outside, the dark lies thick over the settlement. Boats, paths, fences, neighbouring roofs. All of it has vanished into the same blackness. But inside this house, the day has left traces everywhere. In the folded cloth, in the rinsed bowls, in the better-tied bundle, in the drying shoes, in the lowered voices, in the sleeping children who have been carried, corrected and fed through another difficult ordinary day. You begin to understand now what daily life for a Viking woman truly is. Not saga on the scale of monuments, something both smaller and more essential. A life lived in constant negotiation with necessity but not reduced by it. A life constrained by family, season, labour, custom and male authority, and yet still full of competence, judgment, influence, memory and forms of power that do not need to announce themselves loudly to be real. A life in which dignity is made, not granted. A life in which survival is collective, but often organised through a woman's private discipline before dawn and after dark. The fire lowers again, and the room seems to breathe with it. You do not need anyone to explain the lesson now. You've been inside it all day. Now, at the far end of the day, when even the watchfulness in your body has begun to dim, the house feels less like a building than like a record. Everything here has been touched by labour, and nearly all of that labour carries your imprint somewhere inside it. The fire did not hold by accident. The meal did not arrive by accident. The cloth did not improve itself. The children did not drift towards sleep by some gentle law of nature alone. The tools were found, the stores measured, the questions answered, the moods managed, the tasks remembered, the absence absorbed, the small tensions prevented from souring into larger ones. None of it was spectacular. That is precisely what makes it so easy for history to underestimate, and so necessary to bring close again. You sit very still and let the room settle around you. The warmth at the hearth is thinner now, enough to comfort the face while the edges of the body already remember the cold. The longhouse holds the smells of the day in softened form. Smoke, wool, old wood, damp leather, cooked grain, animal warmth carried in from outside, the faint clean trace left by rinsed hands and wiped faces. These are not noble smells in the language of poetry, but they are the smell of a world kept going. Somewhere in the dark beyond the walls the larger Viking age still exists. Ships on black water, traders on difficult roads, men testing luck, alliances shifting, weather deciding the terms of tomorrow. Yet from where you are now, all of that seems almost secondary, not unreal, only dependent. Its motion outward rests on this inward steadiness more than it would ever care to confess. That may be the profound lesson hidden inside ordinary life. The centre of a society is not always where that society chooses to put its glory.
Sometimes the center is here, where a woman sits after everyone else has nearly gone to sleep, feeling the ache in her back and the roughness in her hands, while mentally bridging one day to the next. Sometimes history is held together not by those who make the loudest mark, but by those who prevent things from falling apart in the first place. A Viking woman may not stand at the center of every formal power. She may not command the law in a man's voice, or sail under her own name in most stories that survive. But inside the daily fabric of life, she is everywhere, in order, in memory, in preservation, in timing, in continuity itself.
You look once more across the room. A child breathes evenly under wool. An older woman has finally slipped fully into sleep. A cup sits where it should. A garment waits for morning. The embers pulse low and red. Not dramatic, just dependable. Even now, the room is teaching the same truth it has been teaching since before dawn. Endurance is made of small things tended faithfully. And perhaps that is why this life feels both narrow and immense at once. Narrow, because so much of it is bounded by need, season, duty, kin, and the endless repetition of necessary work. Immense, because within those bounds live judgment, patience, tenderness, strategy, dignity, grief, wit, discipline, memory, and the difficult art of making a shared life possible. There is nothing minor about that, even if it often goes unnamed. If you listen closely enough, the whole day has been a long answer to a question no one in the room ever phrased directly. What is daily life for a Viking woman? It is waking first. It is carrying authority in forms that may look domestic from outside and feel foundational from within. It is being read by others and learning to read them back. It is labour that warms, feeds, clothes, remembers, repairs, anticipates and restrains. It is living within limits without becoming only a victim of them. It is finding room for tenderness without ever being permitted much illusion. It is understanding that survival is practical, but never merely practical, and as the fire sinks lower still, you feel how completely this day is answered not only with facts, but with atmosphere, not only with duties, but with the emotional weather of a real life lived close to necessity. The world you've entered is not simple, not romantic in the foolish sense, not uniformly harsh, not secretly modern, not reducible to myth. It is human. That may be the truest thing that can be said. You lower your gaze. The house is holding. For tonight, that is enough. The embers settle deeper into themselves, and the room seems to breathe more slowly with them. Nothing new is required now. No more carrying, no more counting, no more explaining. Only the soft, familiar work of night finishing what the day began. Around you, wool warms sleeping shoulders. Timber keeps out the dark as best it can. The air smells of smoke and rest and the faint remains of all that was done properly enough to let everyone sleep. And that may be the quietest wisdom this lost world offers. Most lives are not remembered because they were loud. They matter because they were sustaining, because someone rose before light, because someone noticed what was running low, because someone fed others before eating fully herself, because someone mended what would otherwise have split, soothed what would otherwise have sharpened, and carried a household through another ordinary day that only looks ordinary from a distance. To live as a Viking woman was not to inhabit a legend. It was to inhabit a structure of work, kinship, risk, care, and endurance, and to shape that structure from within, day after day, often without ceremony, often without praise, but not without importance. The power in such a life was rarely theatrical. It was steadier than that, quieter, closer to the fire, closer to the hand that remembers where everything is kept and how long it must last. So as the longhouse dims and the night at last gathers everyone into its darker shelter, you're left with something calmer than admiration and deeper than pity. You're left with recognition, a real world, real limits, real skill, real tenderness, a life not built for glory and yet full of meaning because it kept other lives possible. That is a lesson large enough to outlast the room.